Richard Ewell rose through the Confederate ranks to become a corps commander in the Confederacy's most famous army, the Army of Northern Virginia. Many of his contemporaries declared him eccentric or just plain odd. He rarely combed his beard, and as one person explained, his mustache stuck out like the muzzle of a terrier. His high squeaky voice and prominent lisp matched oddly with his liberal use of profanity. Ewell loved battle, and when he, as an officer, would grab a musket and join the skirmishers on the front line, he declared it refreshment. When Ewell stepped up to the command of the 2nd Corps, Stonewall Jackson's corps, after that general's death, Ewell had big shoes to fill and high expectations for his generalship. Because of this, Ewell's calculations or miscalculations around the Battle of Gettysburg and other battles got magnified in the more than a century and a half since the war ended. As a result, Ewell is a general many have heard of, but know little about. Richard Ewell was born to Dr. Thomas Ewell and Elizabeth Stoddard Ewell. His ancestors moved to North America in the 1600s. His grandfather on his father's side was a colonel in the American Revolution, and his grandfather on his mother's side was Benjamin Stoddard, a soldier in the American Revolution as well as the very first Secretary of Navy. Ewell's father, Thomas, went to Pennsylvania University to study medicine. Elizabeth Stoddard's family remained wealthy, and she had a sizable inheritance, but her husband's abrasive personality resulted in him losing business and eventually having to sell the home in Georgetown outside of Washington, D.C., and move to Centerville, Virginia, to a rocky home that produced little in the way of crops that they called Stony Lonesome. It was around Centerville where Richard Stoddard Ewell grew up, becoming an expert writer and something he took pride in and kept up as he got older. His father passed away when Ewell was 9, forcing his mother, whose inheritance was diminished, to teach school to take care of her and her children. Ewell was a great study, although a little rambunctious. The young man spoke bluntly, an attribute he never lost. When someone gave him a book as a gift, his mother prodded him to say thank you, but the little boy replied, "I never asked him for it." When Ewell was 14, his brother Paul, who was studying to be a doctor, passed away. Days after his death, a skeleton was found in an abandoned home that the Ewells owned. At first, it was thought it was a cruel prank, but later found out that Paul was using it in his studies. Richard took on the job of removing the skeleton and putting it away. One moment in his early life that exhibits his determined personality and bravery was when a rabid dog came to their farm. Ewell, who was plowing, got on his horse and rode for the house, yelling to his family to get inside. They got to safety, but Ewell didn't stop there. The dog began running for the neighbor's house. He chased after it, yelling for the family to get to safety. They did, and Ewell got off his horse and approached the door, asking for a rifle to shoot the animal. The neighbor began to hand the gun out the door, but when the dog came around the corner of the house, he retracted it back into the house. Ewell was now dismounted and unarmed. Fortunately for him, the dog took off toward another neighbor's home. Ewell got the rifle and chased after the animal, running it down and killing it. The Ewells were slave owners. However, one African-American woman who lived in the household wasn't a slave. Her name was Fanny Brown, and she was given her freedom when she nursed Thomas Ewell from a dangerous fever and he recovered. She remained a paid servant whom the children loved. When Miss Ewell would rebuke her or pay her an unintentional slight, Fanny would pack her things and head out the door. She wouldn't make it past the gate, though, before the Ewell children would be hugging and crying, begging her not to leave. She would always turn around and return to the house for the children. Ewell's mother wasn't able to send him to college, so she thought West Point would be the best option for him to get an education. His brother Benjamin, a few years earlier, attended and graduated. To help in the appointment, his mother enlisted her brother-in-law, George Campbell, a congressman from Tennessee, to take Ewell to meet with President Andrew Jackson. Jackson was pleased with the young man and sent him to talk with the Secretary of War. The Secretary told him if he could get a recommendation from his congressman, he would get him into the academy. Ewell returned with the recommendation, but the Secretary informed him that all the spots were filled and he would have to wait until the next year. Angry, Ewell waited for a year and was notified of his acceptance into the academy. Ewell was well prepared for his studies initially, but quickly mathematics and drawing courses lowered his standing. He was determined to do well and would read and study long past lights out at the academy, using the dim light of hot coals to continue his studies. When able, he would fish, supposedly not without his friend William T. Sherman. Ewell joined the Dialectic Society, which debated current issues. After a cadet's second year of study, they were finally able to leave campus, returning home during the summer. Ewell, because of his finances, wasn't willing to burden his family by asking for money and remained at the academy. During one summer encampment, the cadets decided to do one of two things: to put together a library or take dance lessons. Ewell chose to dance, but when he couldn't master the steps, the instructor labeled him hopeless. Ewell returned to his quarters and practiced for a month. When he returned to the class, the instructor now labeled him the best waltzer at the point. At the end of his 4 years, Ewell finished 13th in the class of 1840, with men like Sherman and George Thomas besting him, but coming in ahead of future Confederate General Bushrod Johnson. Upon graduation, Ewell chose to be a part of the Dragoons. After visiting with his family, he reported to Carlisle Barracks, the training ground for the Dragoons, where his commanding officer was Edwin Sumner, a strict disciplinarian but a respected officer. Sumner required constant drill and stable duties, something many soldiers complained of, but Ewell liked that all of his time was accounted for. He didn't remain there long before he moved out to the Cherokee Territory to Fort Wayne. There, the group of huts that made up the military installation offered little in the way of civilization, and the added pressures of becoming quartermaster brought him into contact with difficult contractors. While there, to cook him meals and to groom his horse, Ewell purchased a 14-year-old slave boy named Arthur. It was on the frontier where Ewell contemplated marriage. He remarked to his family while at West Point that he would never marry, but in the Cherokee Territory, he began to change his mind. He wrote, "I really think if you can find any person about Stony Lonesome who would like a military life and who is fair to look upon, that I would quit the lonesome life of a bachelor. Should you find one that you think would answer, and that you can recommend, you can give a letter of introduction and send her out. Maybe, as there is a large lot to pick from, you had better send a half a dozen so I can take my choice." He couldn't find any woman he liked on the frontier. As he explained, "This is the worst country for single ladies I ever saw in my life. They are hardly allowed to come of age before they are engaged to be married, however ugly they may be. I have not seen a pretty girl or interested in one since I have been here." He wasn't the most eligible bachelor on the frontier. He was quickly going bald, and he spoke with a pronounced lisp. Ewell's temper he got from his father, and his bluntness he got from his mother, made for an unflattering combination. Ewell also liked to drink, but never so much that it resulted in dereliction of duty. Also on the frontier, his ties to organized religion eroded. Although he still believed in God, he saw missionaries fornicating, stealing, and physically assaulting people all in the name of God, and it disillusioned him toward any church. The U.S. government decided to leave Fort Wayne and construct Fort Scott in what would become the state of Kansas. It was Ewell's responsibility to move the government property from Fort Wayne to Fort Scott. While there, he got one of his first thrilling assignments, escorting traders through Indian Territory to Santa Fe. The party experienced horrendous difficulties transporting wagons and people across the landscape, with mud impeding the vehicles. Worst yet, Ewell didn't get to see Santa Fe. Mexican forces continued the escort short of reaching the city. Ewell returned to Fort Scott, but not before witnessing a gigantic herd of bison that covered the landscape so thickly that he couldn't see the prairie for miles. Furthermore, a herd of bison threatened the group when they stampeded. Captain Philip St. George Cook, Ewell's commander in this expedition, positioned the troops in a wedge formation around the wagons and delivered 3 volleys into the herd that finally resulted in them diverting from their course toward the wagons. Ewell and his command would return to Fort Scott, but Ewell had contracted malaria during the expedition, and it would be something that would continue to hurt him his entire life. It was now the end of 1843, and Ewell would be transferred to Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis, Missouri. There he took command for a short time. While there, a second lieutenant came to his office. His unit had been transferred, and he was requesting a delay from going so that he could propose to his sweetheart. Ewell agreed for the lieutenant to go and propose. That lieutenant was Ulysses S. Grant. Ewell then went to Louisville, Kentucky, and to Indiana on recruitment duty, before coming back to Fort Scott, where he would join Stephen Kearny in a show of military power by moving along the Oregon Trail into Indian country. Ewell's company stayed at Fort Laramie while the rest of the expedition went to South Pass, and then returned to the fort to pick up Ewell's company and head back to Fort Leavenworth, and Fort Scott by way of the Santa Fe Trail. After returning, he sold his slave Arthur because he found him lacking and commented that he would soon try to find an older man in his 30s or 40s that would be more capable of cooking and taking care of his horse. Ewell requested leave at the end of 1845, intending to go home to Virginia for Christmas. Unfortunately, on his journey east, he became deathly ill, probably as a result of his battle with malaria. Some of his family in Tennessee took care of him until he felt well enough to take a boat down the Mississippi River and sail to Virginia. From Richmond, he took a stagecoach home, making it in a horrible state, gaunt and weak. This battle with his reoccurring malaria left him in a near-permanent state of sickliness. Once he recovered, it was 1846, and the United States had annexed Texas, leading to the U.S.-Mexican War. Initially, Ewell was put on recruitment duty in Ohio, but soon he was ordered to Jefferson Barracks to join Lieutenant Philip Kearny's Company F of the 1st Dragoons, which was ordered to Point Isabel, Texas, in preparation for Zachary Taylor's invasion of Mexico. After arriving at Point Isabel, Texas, Richard Ewell and Company F of the 1st Dragoons joined Zachary Taylor's force occupying northern Mexico, but most of the fighting had already been done by Taylor's army. Ewell performed a few reconnaissances, but more action lay ahead, as that company was to be the escort of Old Fuss and Feathers Winfield Scott on his campaign to capture Mexico City. Ewell and the Dragoons moved out for the coast and took ships to Veracruz, where U.S. forces landed and laid siege to the port town. Pushing inland, the Dragoons went everywhere Scott did and got to know his staff very well. The staff included Robert E. Lee, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, George McClellan, and others. Soon outside of Veracruz, the U.S. forces ran into a Mexican force commanded by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna at Cerro Gordo. Richard Ewell didn't take part in the main attack, but his brother Tom did. Tom was a lieutenant in the 1st Mounted Rifles and was one of the first Americans to swarm over the Mexican position. After killing one enemy soldier, he received a gunshot wound to the stomach. The Dragoons were ordered to give chase to the retreating Mexican army, but before he passed too far to the front, Richard Ewell went to see his brother. He learned about his brother's wounding and that it was mortal, but he couldn't remain with him long. He had to join the Dragoons in the pursuit. Once finished with his duties, he returned to his brother, who was brought into the American lines and made comfortable. Ewell sat by his brother's side as the wounded soldier's legs began to go numb, and at about 1 a.m., Tom Ewell passed away. Richard got a coffin and buried his brother. The U.S. Army pushed further inland to Puebla and then into the valley that contained Mexico City. It would be difficult to get into the city because of the landscape that prevented the American army from maneuvering toward the capital. However, some of General Scott's staff found a way through the lava beds known as the Pedregal and outflanked the Mexican position. Ewell took note of one of the staff members. He wrote, "I really think one of the most talented men connected with this army is Captain Lee of the Engineers. By his daring reconnaissances pushed up to the cannon's mouth, he has enabled General Scott to fight his battles almost without leaving his tent. His modest, quiet deportment is perfectly refreshing compared to the folly and bombast of the generals and officers made by Mr. Polk." Ewell and the Dragoons assisted the infantry in what became the Battle of San Antonio. It was Ewell's first time under fire. Although he didn't take a prominent role, the experience only made his love for battle more intense. Ewell got his chance to take part in another battle at Churubusco. In pursuit of the Mexicans, he and the Dragoons passed over the Churubusco River Bridge, with Mexicans firing on them from the water and the sides of the road. 2 artillery pieces in a redoubt confronted the Dragoons, but Captain Philip Kearny and Ewell pressed on, not realizing that their superior had called for a withdrawal. Those 2 and a handful of others, who were unaware of the order, attacked the battery, but at a terrible cost. Ewell lost 2 horses. The second one was able to carry him back at a walk. Kearny's left arm was shattered from a canister round, and Ewell grabbed him around the waist and brought him to safety. Soon, American forces captured the fortress that was Chapultepec, and although Ewell didn't take part in the attack, his cousin and West Point friend Levi Gant did, and was killed, shot in the chest. Gant had come to Ewell just before the attack, believing he would die taking the place, and instructed Ewell as to how he wanted his affairs taken care of. After the American army captured Mexico City, Ewell buried his cousin. He had lost 2 invaluable family members in the war, and buried them on Mexican soil. He wrote back home about his sorrow at losing both men whom he relied on and became closer to on account of their campaigning. Ewell's time during the occupation of Mexico City was fairly uneventful, but he did join the Aztec Club, a club formed by a group of officers to commemorate their time in Mexico. When the occupation ended, Ewell returned to Jefferson Barracks, but he became ill again, probably his recurring bout with malaria, and the Army gave him leave to return home to Virginia. After recovering, he didn't head west, but stayed in the east, at Carlisle Barracks and other eastern cities on recruitment duty. Ewell sought promotion, but promotion in the Army was stagnant, although the Mexican War helped facilitate the movement of officers up the chain of command. Ewell took a personal interest in one promotion that seemed to derail his hopes of rising up. Lieutenant James Shamburg had been forced to resign from the Army in 1838 for ungentlemanly conduct. Shamburg hoped to be reinstated into the Army at his old rank. If he did, he would have seniority over Ewell and knock him down the ladder of possible promotions. Ewell felt so strongly about the man's reinstatement into the Dragoons that he took his appeal not to allow Shamburg back in all the way up to President Zachary Taylor. In the end, Shamburg didn't get his reappointment. Another matter occurred when Lucius Northrop, a lieutenant in the Dragoons who had been absent for 3 years for sickness, the same years in which the Mexican War partially occurred, and Northrop hadn't taken part in the conflict, yet he was promoted to a captain in the Dragoons. Ewell believed he deserved the rank, not Northrop, and again addressed the administration about his grievance. Senator Jefferson Davis from Mississippi supported Northrop in the promotion, and Ewell lost this battle, but never forgot or forgave Davis for what he saw as an injustice. One of the recruits that Ewell signed up deserted after only 3 months. When apprehended, he claimed that Ewell drugged him and forced him into the Army. Ultimately, Ewell was found innocent, because why had the man remained in the Army for 3 months before leaving if he had been forced there against his will? Ewell moved around on recruitment duty from Carlisle Barracks to Baltimore, Maryland, to Richmond, Virginia. In Maryland, he attended a medieval-themed party thrown by a socialite family, which included a tilting tournament, where riders would use a lance to spear rings suspended in the air. One of the officers he competed against was Ambrose Powell Hill. In mid-1850, after serving only 2 months in Richmond, he was sent to Santa Fe for duty in the Southwest. He took command of a conglomeration of troops at Fort Leavenworth to command them on the Santa Fe Trail. Officers who joined them on the journey were Alfred Pleasanton of the 2nd Dragoons and Henry Heath of the 6th Infantry. Along the way, he met up with Kit Carson, the famed frontiersman. Carson got word that a wagon train was going to be attacked by an outlaw, so Ewell took about 25 soldiers, and he and Carson overtook the wagon train and arrested the outlaw. This started a friendship between Ewell and Carson that would last for years. The Southwest would be his duty station for roughly the next 10 years. About half of that time would be spent in what would become New Mexico at a location called Los Lunas. The departmental commander was his old superior Edwin Sumner, who sought to save the Army money. For years, the government purchased firewood and food for the soldiers, but now they would be required to forage for their own fuel and put out gardens to grow their own food. Ewell took to farming at the military outpost quickly and successfully. They grew all kinds of vegetables, including 3,000 cabbages in 1 year. Ewell also estimated that his garden saved the Army around $3,000, but could be even more. He kept himself busy in the garden, but he also had to patrol the frontier and chase Apaches and other Native Americans around the Southwest. For the most part, he didn't make any contact with them and only found tracks, but at the Battle of the Penasco River, Ewell finally came into contact with warriors, and he did an incredible job in encountering the enemy and in the pursuit. Although not a big engagement, Ewell's skill as an officer was on full display and was considered a huge moment in the hindering of the attacks by tribes against settlers moving into the New Mexico territory. After this battle, Ewell received a letter asking him to take charge of a plantation in Middle Tennessee. The name at the bottom of the page was Lizinka Campbell Brown. Lizinka was the daughter of George W. Campbell, the man who helped Ewell get into West Point, as well as Ewell's first cousin. It's not a surprise that Ewell had feelings for his cousin. The Ewells had a habit of intermarrying, a habit that resulted in many of the Ewells being eccentric at best and strange at worst, with Richard Ewell being declared the most normal of the Ewells. Lazinka's mother and father moved to Russia when George Campbell was named the minister to Russia. The Campbells arrived with 3 children and lost all 3 quickly to typhus that hit the city they were in. The Campbells had 2 more children while they were in Russia, one of them being Elizabeth, who they affectionately called Lazinka, naming her after Tsar Alexander I's wife. Both her and the Tsar consoled the Campbells following the death of their children, and they thought so much of her that Elizabeth always went by Lazinka. Shortly after she was born, the Campbells moved back to the United States, where Lazinka became a Washington and Tennessee socialite. Ewell got to know his cousin well when they were younger, but when he went off to West Point, he had to keep track of her through his siblings and cousins, but they hadn't remained close. Lazinka married James Percy Brown, a man educated to be a lawyer, but would rather dabble in politics and manage his plantations. During their marriage, they had 3 children, but Brown mistreated Lazinka and would take his own life, leaving Lazinka a widow at 24. With the death of her father, brother, and husband within a short amount of time, she now inherited tens of thousands of acres of plantation land and urban lots, as well as a fortune in investments. Lazinka was one of the most eligible and rich widows in the country, and she wanted Ewell to come manage one of her properties. Ewell turned down the offer. Despite his less than spectacular pay in the Army, Ewell was able to save a considerable amount of it and invest it in the stock market and other ventures, taking high risks and come out ahead. He wasn't anywhere close to Lazinka's wealth, but he was doing well for an Army captain, a rank he finally achieved, commanding Company G of the 1st Dragoons. After a brief visit to Lazinka and his family, he traveled back to the southwest, but was transferred away from his beautiful garden at Los Lunas and ordered to what would become Arizona. He and other officers attempted to create a fort near Tucson and chased after Apaches when not performing monotonous duties around the encampment. In mid-1856, Ewell was involved in and gained a great reputation in the military for his role in the Battle of the Gila, where he attacked an Apache village and captured dozens of women and children, all with minimal casualties. Ewell was becoming known throughout the Army as an excellent Indian fighter. Richard Ewell remained in the Southwest throughout the 1850s at one of the most isolated military posts in the region, Fort Buchanan, named after President James Buchanan, who took office in 1857. It was a place of boredom for Ewell and all who garrisoned the outpost. Ewell wrote, "This place is dull beyond anything I ever imagined. Nothing going on. I try to work myself tired in the company garden so as to sleep away some of the time, but it won't do." Complaints came up about the fort because it was too far from both the mail route and the town of Tucson, both of which the dragoons were supposed to protect. The garrison also was far from the heaviest concentration of Apaches, the tribe they were supposed to be protecting the mail route in Tucson from. Complaints continued to roll into Washington from citizens and travelers from Arizona complaining about the increase in raids by the Apache. Ewell and other officers explained that if they mobilized both companies at Fort Buchanan to attack the Apache, that would leave the mail route and various settlements open to attack and make the situation worse. The best thing for them to do was to operate as they had always been, unless they were heavily reinforced. Amid this boredom, Ewell became an amateur mineralogist and chemist. He converted his bachelor pad into a makeshift chemistry lab where he conducted experiments with various minerals he found. Silver, gold, and copper were an interest throughout the region for mining purposes, and Ewell, along with some of his other companions, purchased a silver mine and began buying the equipment to operate it. Ewell watched his money double multiple times as interest in the mine grew. This helped alleviate some boredom experienced at Fort Buchanan. In early 1859, Company D of the 8th Infantry and its commanding officer came to replace Company D of the 1st Dragoons at Fort Buchanan. This left Ewell's Company G as the only mounted unit in the fort. Ewell decided to take a 60-day leave since the fort was in new hands, and it was granted. He didn't go far, though. He remained around the fort, but spent a lot of time at his silver mine, named the Patagonia Mine. It hadn't been the success he believed it would be, not because there wasn't silver there, but Ewell believed it lacked good management, Fights broke out between Mexican laborers and American laborers, and the dragoons had to come settle the dispute. A Dutch merchant bought out two of the owners of the mine over the winter of 1858 to 1859. Ewell thought he was a good businessman, but a poor manager. Under this man's supervision, the mine fell into disarray, and Ewell decided to sell his stake in the mine for $4,000. Soon the mine would be sold to a man who could operate it efficiently, and it produced a profit of $1,300 a day, making its owner rich. Ewell took part in a diplomatic dispute while at Fort Buchanan. A survey was to be done in the Mexican province of Sonora by a United States Army surveyor, but its governor refused to allow the surveyor to do his job. Ewell was dispatched to discuss with the governor a solution to the problem, but when he arrived, the dispute had already been resolved by another U.S. Army officer. Ewell decided not to reopen the wound and began his return to the United States. At the town of Hermosillo, Ewell was arrested by Mexican officials for stealing a mule. He was unable to leave the town until a U.S. Army officer negotiated his release. That wasn't the first time Ewell crossed into Mexico during his time at Fort Buchanan. Two deserters took some of Ewell's best horses and rode for the border. Ewell chased them down even though they had a 36-hour head start. He got one alive, but the other took his own life before Ewell found him. Once back at Fort Buchanan, Ewell joined an expedition against the Apache that took the troops on a 350-mile journey, during which they killed 8 warriors and took 23 prisoners, mostly women and children. Ewell was slightly wounded in the hand during the expedition. A Virginian working in Arizona was welcomed by Ewell into his quarters, and he could stay at Fort Buchanan. The Virginian remembered that the captain used to attend the drill in person, and when vexed, he was not very particular about his language, and would cuss the soldiers very lustfully. But no other man dared do it in the captain's presence, for he loved his soldiers, and, although he talked roughly to them, he always took care that they were made as comfortable as possible, and his soldiers all liked him. Ewell brought a slave with him to Arizona from his Virginia home, a woman named Hester. She kept house and cooked meals for Ewell. The Virginian recalled that Hester would scold Ewell for not taking better care of himself all the time. One of Ewell's most famous moments while in Arizona was when an 11-year-old girl named Mercedes was abducted from a lumber camp. Ewell found the Apache culprits and negotiated a release of the girl in exchange for 24 Apache women and children being released from Fort Buchanan. Ewell agreed and entered Tucson with Mercedes. The town was exuberant. It was April 1860, and a group of prominent men in Arizona were meeting in Tucson to create a constitution for the territory of Arizona. The Constitutional Convention, in recognition of and to honor Ewell, granted him an honorary seat on the convention floor, a vote of thanks, and named one of the territory's original 4 counties after him. Soon, Ewell got word that the garrison would move to Fort Breckinridge, a location better suited to deal with the Apache, but Ewell didn't get to move into the new fort. He was ordered to Fort Bliss for court-martial duty in Texas, but the trial was moved to Albuquerque. Ewell tried to get sick leave because his health was fast deteriorating, but his commander ordered him to stay on until the trial ended. While the trial was going on, word came that South Carolina seceded from the Union. Most officers didn't think it would lead to civil war. Ewell explained, "Everyone here is on the tenterhooks of impatience to know what the Southern states will do. Officers generally are very much averse to anything like civil war, though some of the younger ones are a little warlike. The truth is, in the Army there are no sectional feelings, and many from the extreme ends of the Union are the most intimate friends." When the court-martial ended, Ewell headed east toward Virginia. In Texas, some secessionists were threatening to attack a military post, and Ewell offered his services to the post commander while he was in the area if the secessionists made good their threats. After that, he steamed toward Virginia, arriving at his family home at Stony Lonesome, emaciated from the trip. His health was so poor that his sister declared he had come home to die. The Army gave him an extension of his leave for 10 months total, so that he could return to Arizona outside of the sickly season. In April, after the firing on Fort Sumter, Virginia seceded. Ewell hated to hear the news. He wrote later that, "If there were anything I had to dread and regret in '61, it was this war. I was too sick and too busy sowing guano and timothy and etc. to think much about it, but I clung to the last ray of hope like a drowning man to straws." On April 24, 1861, Ewell resigned from the Army. It is hard to account for my course except from a painful sense of duty. I say painful because I believe few were more devoted to the old country than myself. It was like death to me. Virginia and the Confederacy quickly brought him into their military, making him a lieutenant colonel and in charge of cavalry instruction just north of Richmond. He was there barely 3 weeks before being sent to Culpeper Courthouse and then to Fairfax Courthouse. There, Federal cavalry made a raid at 3 a.m. on June 1st, taking Ewell and his command by surprise. Ewell, in his nightshirt, found some of his cavalry and formed them along the road over which he believed the Union horsemen would travel back through the town. The enemy approached, and Ewell, afraid he might shoot his own men in the dark, came forward and asked who goes there. The answer came back, cavalry. Ewell replied, what cavalry? And the Union reply came back in the form of a pistol bullet that grazed his shoulder near his neck. The rebels opened fire and a small skirmish erupted. The Federal troops rode off in another direction, and the engagement ended. A few weeks later, a rapid rise in promotion struck Ewell, who found himself a brigadier general in charge of a brigade of infantry made up of the 5th and 6th Alabama and the 6th Louisiana. He was to be on the right of the Confederate defensive line opposite the Union forces coming out of Washington, D.C. When the Union Army of the Potomac moved, Ewell nearly got caught off guard because the commander on his left failed to inform him of the withdrawal. Nevertheless, Ewell extricated his troops and withdrew toward Manassas Junction. On the way, a Union woman came running into the Confederate lines, bent on telling anyone in authority the important information to the Confederate cause. Soldiers brought her to Ewell, who listened to the lady. After hearing her, he said, look there, miss. Don't you see those men with blue clothes on in the edge of the woods? Look at those men loading those big guns. They are going to fire and fire quickly and fire right here. You'll get killed. You'll be a dead damsel in less than a minute. Get away from here. Get away. The lady didn't move, and he marveled at her courage. Ewell then turned to Major John B. Gordon and said, women. I tell you, sir, women would make a grand brigade if it was not for snakes and spiders. They don't mind bullets. Women are not afraid of bullets. But one big black snake would put a whole army to flight. Ewell's men guarded a ford of Bull Run downstream from Blackburn's Ford. He kept his men under arms in case of an attack, but the musketry heard in the distance was the Union testing Blackburn's Ford. During the First Battle of Manassas on July 21, 1861, Ewell and his brigade didn't see much action. He could hear the roar of battle, and his staff remembered him repeating that he had no orders. When he finally was ordered to the Confederate left where the action was occurring, the fighting had pretty much ended. One event that did cheer up Ewell was the arrival of Lizinka Brown's son, Campbell Brown, who was to be put on Ewell's staff. The young man arrived just prior to the battle. It's from Brown that we know a great deal about Ewell's time during the war because he wrote extensive accounts of the general in his reminiscences. For example, after the battle, when the Confederates began to push north toward Alexandria and Washington, D.C., Ewell came to a woman's house and asked for some buttermilk when he was thirsty. When the woman left the porch to fetch the milk, Ewell picked up a pair of scissors the woman had been using and began to cut his hair. He only got half his hair cut before the woman returned, and Ewell set down the scissors, drank the milk, and rode off. Brown remembered it was multiple days before Ewell finished the cut. After the First Battle of Manassas, Ewell met President of the Confederacy Jefferson Davis. He already didn't have a good relationship with the man because of his belief that when the president was a senator, he committed an injustice by supporting another officer over himself. Now in Northern Virginia, in another army, Ewell and Davis would again butt heads. Ewell brought up the idea of arming slaves to help fight the Union. Davis recoiled at the idea, saying that it would lead to a revolt and overturn the Confederacy. Plus, he added, who would command them? Ewell said that he would command them if the units were formed. Davis wasn't convinced of the idea. Years later, Davis declared that the conversation never happened. However, even if Ewell didn't bring it up to Davis, as the general insisted, Ewell did bring up that idea to family members, demonstrating that Ewell believed in the action and supported it, even suggesting it. Ewell and the rest of the Confederate Army, now entirely under the command of Joseph E. Johnston, remained in Northern Virginia. Ewell was briefly placed in command of the Stonewall Brigade when Thomas Stonewall Jackson, the commander of the brigade, was given a promotion and independent command in the Shenandoah Valley. Ewell's time as its commander lasted only a few days, and the brigade was sent to Jackson, who had requested it, leaving Ewell without troops to command. When James Longstreet was promoted to division command, his old brigade of Virginians was now placed under Ewell. By the end of the year, Campbell Brown's mother, Lizinka, came to visit her son and Ewell. Lizinka spent a great deal of time with the general, and soon Ewell asked her to marry him. She said yes, and they were engaged. Their love story began when they were children, and had been interrupted when Ewell went to West Point, and Lizinka married James Percy Brown. Now the two were reunited. With the opening of the year 1862, Ewell became rapidly promoted. Many generals were sent to other theaters, creating a power vacuum that saw Ewell jump to major general and division command. He would take command of Edmund Kirby Smith's old division, but Ewell didn't believe he had earned it. He felt that his performance at First Bull Run was disappointing and believed someone like Jubal Early should be the division's commander. Nonetheless, Ewell jumped into the job and performed it well. One soldier remembered he seemed thoroughly interested in his calling and is very strict and vigilant in his superintendence of everything connected with his command. I have been struck with this at his inspections. He has an eye of which nothing escapes, and woe to the luckless soldier who endeavors to screen from his observation a rusty musket or any disorder in his equipments. He seems to take in everything at a glance. Ewell had 3 brigades in this division. His brigadiers were Isaac Trimble, Richard Taylor, and Arnold Elzey. Taylor, in his post-war work, wrote about Ewell in great detail. Bright, prominent eyes, a bomb-shaped bald head, and a nose like that of Francis of Valois gave him a striking resemblance to a woodcock, and this was increased by a bird-like habit of putting his head on one side to utter his quaint speeches. He fancied that he had some mysterious internal malady, and would eat nothing but frumentary, a preparation of wheat, and his plaintive way of talking of his disease as if he were someone else was droll in the extreme. His nervousness prevented him from taking regular sleep, and he passed nights curled around a camp stool in positions to dislocate an ordinary person's joints. The Union Army of the Potomac, now under George B. McClellan, moved against the Confederate defensive line in northern Virginia, and the Confederate Army's commander, Joseph E. Johnston, began to withdraw south. The Union threat left, but the rebel troops remained at their positions. Food became scarce, and disease ran throughout the camps. Soldiers searched local homes for food, but came up short. Ewell went on his own hunt for food and came back with a scrawny cow, which he proudly displayed to Taylor. Taylor said it was hardly enough to feed a division. Ewell, discouraged, replied, "Ah, I was thinking of my 50 dragoons." In April, the military situation drastically changed in Virginia. McClellan shipped his army to the peninsula in Virginia, created by the York and James Rivers, and Johnston moved most of his army to the peninsula to guard Richmond. He left Ewell's division and another command along the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers. Ewell possessed about 8,000 infantry and was ordered to work with Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who operated in the Shenandoah Valley. Ewell was itching for a fight and requested to cross the river when able and attack the enemy force equal to his own size. But before he could launch an attack, Henry Kidd Douglas from Jackson's command arrived, exhausted from his journey over the Blue Ridge Mountains. After telling Ewell he was to meet Jackson at Swift Run Gap, Douglas passed out. Ewell caught the young man and brought him to his own cot, giving him brandy, coffee, and food to revive him. Ewell marched his men to the valley, making it to Conrad's store where he met with Jackson in person. Jackson was moving to link up with Edward Johnson's force, and Ewell was to stay put until Jackson returned. Ewell bristled at being so coldly ordered to do something, and their formerly cordial relationship now turned into a strained one. Colonel James A. Walker of the 13th Virginia in Ewell's command remembered being at Ewell's headquarters when the general asked, "Did it ever occur to you that General Jackson is crazy?" Walker explained that he had been a student under Jackson and that they called him Tom Fool Jackson, but never thought he was crazy. Ewell then declared, "I tell you, sir, he is as crazy as a March hare. He has gone away, I don't know where, and left me here with instructions to stay until he returns. I tell you, sir, he is crazy, and I will just march my division away from here. I do not mean to have it cut to pieces at the behest of a crazy man." Walker left headquarters and met with his brigade commander Arnold Elzey. Elzey said to Walker, "I tell you, sir, General Ewell is crazy. and I have a serious notion of marching my brigade back to Gordonsville." About that time, a conscript came into the headquarters and demanded Elzey sign a paper to get him out of the army. This angered Elzey, who pulled 2 pistols and began shooting at the man, who immediately began running. Elzey missed and said, "If I could have only gotten hold of my pistol sooner." To the series of events he just witnessed, Walker said, "Well, I don't know what to do with myself. I was up to see General Ewell just now, and he said that General Jackson is crazy. I come down to see you, and you say that General Ewell is crazy. And I have not the slightest doubt that my conscript, who ran from you just now, will report it all over camp that General Elzey is crazy. So it seems I have fallen into evil hands, and I reckon the best thing for me to do is to turn the conscripts loose and march the rest of my regiment back to Richmond." It's during Ewell's initial entrance into the valley when we get a reference to Friday, a Native American boy who accompanied Ewell. The records list Friday as a slave, but the true relationship is unclear. Ewell bought the Pueblo boy from an Apache chief who had threatened to kill the boy. Ewell paid $75 for him. Friday would accompany Ewell throughout the war, but little is known about him. Ewell waited impatiently for Jackson to return from his foray against John C. Fremont's forces in the mountains of western Virginia. Ewell also received messages from Joseph E. Johnston, concerned about Union forces moving out of the valley and threatening Richmond. Ewell was in a tough spot. Jackson told him to stay put, but he was being ordered to keep an eye out for movement in central Virginia. At his core, Ewell was a fighter, and he was discouraged by the lack of action he saw. When Jackson finally made his return, he and Ewell sat down to discuss the upcoming campaign in the valley. It was at this meeting that Ewell and Jackson became closer. Ewell no longer harbored resentment against Jackson for leaving him at Conrad's store. Both looked forward to the upcoming campaign. However, the plans nearly got shredded when Ewell received word from Johnston that he was needed further east. Ewell returned to Jackson to discuss this new development. They decided the situation had changed from the time Johnston sent the message, but the 2 gentlemen wouldn't have to worry about their plans being ruined for long. Johnston sent another order, giving them leeway, and they took it. Ewell and Jackson moved down the valley to Front Royal to outflank Union forces entrenched at Strasburg. At Front Royal, they either captured or drove away the entire enemy force there. From there, the 2 generals kept up their momentum, pushing further north, trying to cut off the Union troops under Nathaniel Banks at Strasburg. After the victory at Front Royal, Jackson's army pushed on toward Winchester. The Confederates made camp along the way, and Ewell worked into the night. He finally sat down next to the campfire with his staff. Willis, Campbell Brown's slave, nudged his owner and said there was someone digging through his saddlebags. It was General Isaac Trimble. Brown turned to Ewell and said, "General, look at that old rascal stealing my corn." Ewell told Willis to go tell Trimble to return the corn he had stolen. When confronted, Trimble indignantly asked who sent the message. Willis pointed to Ewell. Trimble replaced 3 of the 9 stolen ears of corn and went to rifle through someone else's saddlebags. Despite their attempt to trap Banks's force, the Union commander made it to Winchester, where Ewell and Jackson joined forces to drive the Federal troops through the town. Unfortunately for the Confederates, their cavalry wasn't on hand to quickly pursue the enemy, and many of them got away. But this victory had a huge ripple effect across the Eastern Theater. With Banks leaving the valley, this made the Union shift more troops there, helping to prevent the link-up between Irvin McDowell and George B. McClellan's forces around Richmond. Ewell and Jackson couldn't enjoy the victory for long. They pushed all the way up to Harper's Ferry and a little beyond, but James Shields' Union command and John C. Fremont's troops were aiming for Strasburg to cut Jackson off from the rest of the valley. When Ewell and Jackson discovered this, they got their men in wagons on the valley pike as quickly as they could. It would be a race for Strasburg. In late May 1862, Stonewall Jackson and his Army of the Valley was at the northern reaches of the Shenandoah, with 2 Union contingents threatening to cut them off from the south. Ewell's division went south first in the race to get to Strasburg, the location where the 2 Union generals, John C. Fremont and James Shields, would link up. Jackson ordered Ewell to get to the town, then head west to hold off Fremont's force coming out of western Virginia, while the rest of Jackson's command made it safely south of the town. When Ewell encountered Fremont's force, it puzzled him. Confederate skirmishers pushed back their Union counterparts all the way to the main Union body, giving ground with little to no resistance. Ewell went all the way to the front to try and make sense of the odd occurrence. Fremont's initiative dwindled, and he didn't attempt to make it to Strasburg with Ewell in his way. The Valley Army quickly filed down the Valley Turnpike, and Ewell joined them in their push south, having escaped the Union trap. He came through the lines that Joseph E. Johnston, the Confederate Army commander in the east, had been seriously wounded defending Richmond. Names were batted around as to who would now take command. Soldiers heard Beauregard or Jackson would now take command, but Ewell allegedly thought of someone else. He supposedly said, "I don't know who will be General Johnston's successor, but I shan't be scared at all if the choice falls on Lee." Fremont gained courage and began to pursue Jackson and Ewell vigorously. During the pursuit, Turner Ashby, the flamboyant cavalry officer during the Valley Campaign, turned on the Yankees and requested Ewell to send him infantry support. Ewell did, and they helped to rout the enemy, but Ashby was killed in the process. Ewell liked Ashby, and his death affected Ewell greatly, especially because of Ewell's background as a dragoon. Ewell helped to get the body to Port Republic, but Ewell didn't leave the battlefield. He remained to help wounded men onto horses to get them to safety, because ambulance wagons couldn't make it through the woods. To the men who were too badly wounded to be carried off, they were left to the mercy of the Federals. Before leaving, Ewell took money out of his own pocket to give to those men left behind to help them while in captivity. The men who received Ewell's selfless act never forgot it and declared they loved the man and would go anywhere he ordered them to. On June 8th, Ewell commanded Jackson's forces at Cross Keys, while Jackson personally commanded troops 4 miles to the east at Port Republic. Jackson ordered Ewell to hold off Fremont, as Shields was approaching Jackson through the Page Valley. The Battle of Cross Keys would be the first time Ewell would fight a battle independently. Ewell faced a force more than double his own and held off Fremont's attacks throughout the day, all the while being sprayed by Union artillery from the opposing hills. Many officers were hit, including Arnold Elzey and George Stewart. Even Campbell Brown, Ewell's staffer, cousin, and soon-to-be stepson, was hit, but Brown's wound wasn't significant. Ewell ordered him to safety anyway. To protect his left flank, Ewell personally took command of the left flank, his weakest point, and directed troop movements to secure it. Ewell defeated Fremont and rode to Port Republic to inform Jackson, who told him of his plan to attack Shields the next morning. Ewell would leave a strong rear guard and bring up the rest of his force to Port Republic. When Ewell returned to Cross Keys, General Isaac Trimble, one of Ewell's brigade commanders, requested attacking Fremont on the Kieseltown Road. It was dark, and Ewell told Trimble a night attack would be dangerous, but if Trimble felt compelled, he could talk with Jackson. He did, and returned to Ewell with Jackson's orders to let Ewell decide whether he would attack or not. By this point it was 2 a.m., and a night attack would be too risky, and as he explained to Trimble, he needed to be on hand for Jackson's attack later that morning. Ewell marched his force to Port Republic to help Jackson in the attack. Ewell personally led multiple attacks during the battle, but his most famous of the engagement was when Richard Taylor's Louisianians were driven back. He got in front of them, pointed at a Union artillery battery, and declared, "Men, you all know me. We must go back to that battery." He and the Louisianians captured the position, Ewell losing a horse in the attack. He grabbed a horse attached to a wagon and took off on it, after the enemy, remembering his time in the dragoons. After the battle, Jackson came up to his generals as they watched the Federals flee, and put his hand on Ewell's sleeve, saying, "He who does not see the hand of God in this is blind, sir, blind." The Army of the Valley moved to Brown's Gap, where they could either fight Shields or Fremont in the valley, or move through the mountains and rest. Ewell ate supper with Colonel Thomas Munford, and afterward, sitting outside his tent relaxing, asked Munford if he remembered all the horrible stuff he had said about Jackson. Munford said he did, and Ewell responded, "I take it all back, and will never prejudge another man. Old Jackson is no fool. He knows how to keep his own counsel, and does curious things. But he has method in his madness. He has disappointed me entirely." Later, he wrote of the Valley Campaign in Jackson, "When he commenced it, I thought him crazy. Before he ended it, I thought him inspired." The Valley Campaign came to an end as Fremont and Shields moved northward. Despite the successful campaign, Ewell did receive a scolding from Jackson. At the Battle of Port Republic, Ewell observed a brave Union officer on a white horse and told his men to spare such bravery. Jackson heard about this and told Ewell this was ordinary war, and the brave and gallant Federal officers were the very kind that must be killed. Shoot the brave officers, and the cowards will run away and take the men with them. That was the only complaint Jackson or others had with Ewell. One soldier told a newspaper, "His division has done more hard work and hard fighting in the last 2 weeks than any other part of the Army of the Valley. In 16 days they fought 7 battles, and in every instance were victorious. It is the first time that General Ewell has had an opportunity of showing in battle how skillfully and bravely he could handle an army. Never defeated, never surprised, always at the right place at the right time, he has earned and well merits the title of general." Under a cloud of secrecy, Ewell moved with the Valley Army east, not exactly sure where Stonewall determined their final destination to be. By the time the army got to Gordonsville, Virginia, it was evident that they were on their way to Richmond to fight George B. McClellan. When they arrived at the outskirts of the Confederate capital, the new commander of the Confederate Army in the east, Robert E. Lee, planned to attack the isolated Union corps of Fitz-John Porter and Jackson's force, would swing around to Porter's rear and unseat him from the fortifications. After getting their orders from Jackson, Ewell and another man asked if they should take the same road or march by parallel routes. Jackson said he would let them know in the morning. Ewell turned to the other man as they left the tent and said the reason Jackson needs time is that he has to pray about it. The other gentleman realized he forgot his sword in the tent and went back and found Jackson praying, just like Ewell said. The next series of engagements will become known as the 7 Days Battle. At the Battle of Mechanicsville, Jackson's troops didn't engage the enemy. At Gaines' Mill, Ewell finally came into contact with McClellan's troops. As he deployed his men, Trimble's brigade got lost, and Ewell went into the battle with significantly less troops than he could normally field. Ewell fought desperately to overtake the enemy position. His Louisianians broke, leaving a wide gap in the line. He attempted to extend the line by using a handful of Trimble's men who had made it to the battle. The ammunition ran low and then completely out. Ewell instructed his men to hold the ground with the bayonet if necessary until reinforcements arrived. Help came in the form of John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade and Alexander Lawton's Georgians. With his front secure, Ewell moved to Arnold Elzey's brigade. Elzey had been seriously wounded in the face and his men were falling back. Ewell took control of the situation and personally led Elzey's men up the slopes. His horse Maggie was shot dead on the climb, and Ewell scrambled to his feet and continued the charge on foot. A Union bullet glanced off a tree and hit him in the lower leg, but his boot took most of the damage, and the bullet only left a bruise. After these attacks, permission was given for Ewell and his division to be taken out of action. Although his division disengaged, Ewell remained on the field, helping other division and brigade commanders, since he had been on the field for 4 hours and knew the ground. Later in the day, a Union force was observed throwing up a barricade, but the Confederates couldn't tell whether there were any cannons at the location or how many there would be. Ewell brought up 2 cannons and began to fire on it. 3 Union batteries opened up on him, and he told the commander of the artillery to withdraw. As Ewell was leaving the hill where the rebel artillery was placed, a Union cannonball passed just inches from his face, causing the general to jerk backward. The ball hit a tree, cutting it clean in two, and in such a perfect manner that the tree planted itself straight up in the ground next to the stump. Ewell yelled out, "Wasn't that beautiful? Wasn't that well done?" McClellan's forces began pulling back down the peninsula, and it was during this withdrawal that a humorous story arose where a musician came upon Ewell with his pants down, picking lice. He said it was a sight of Ewell many hadn't seen or cared to. At Malvern Hill, Ewell's division was split up, and the general basically had only Jubal Early's brigade to command. Early was new to Ewell's division, taking the place of Arnold Elzey, as that general had been seriously wounded. Early's brigade got lost, and Ewell spent most of the battle helping other commands launch bloody attacks against the slopes of Malvern Hill. As the Confederate Army pursued McClellan, they reached Herring Creek, where McClellan's troops dug in. Ewell reconnoitered the position, then decided to get some sleep. He sat on a crate, pulled his knees up to his chin, and attempted to take a nap. It was quickly interrupted by Union sharpshooters who sent one bullet between Ewell's foot and thigh, and another one pierced his hat on his head. so he went behind a hill to continue his nap. Lee pulled his army back toward Richmond, and McClellan began slowly leaving the peninsula. To the north was another threat, however. The Union Army of Virginia was a conglomeration of commands from Irving McDowell, John C. Fremont, and Nathaniel Banks, led by a general fresh from the west, John Pope. Pope exclaimed when he took command that in the west he had only seen the backs of the enemy. When Ewell heard this pronouncement, he replied, "He'll never see the backs of my troops. Their pantaloons are out at the rear, and the sight would paralyze this western bully." Lee dispatched Jackson along with Ewell's division to suppress Pope. Traveling to Gordonsville, Ewell and his staff stopped at a gentleman's home to rest and eat. As they sat down, a lightning bolt struck a haystack and set it ablaze. The flames were destined for the stable. The old man resigned himself to the fact that the whole stable would be lost, but Ewell organized his staff to extinguish the blaze. At Gordonsville, Ewell drilled his men, waiting on orders from Jackson to strike at Pope. He sat down to write a letter to his niece. In her last letter, she wrote happily to hear that Ewell took part in the fighting around Richmond. He explained in his letter to her that it may be all very well to wish young heroes to be in a fight, but for my part, I would be satisfied never to see another field. What pleasure can there be in seeing thousands of dead and dying in every horrible agony, torn to pieces by artillery and etc.? Many times the wounded being left on the field for 24 hours before they can be cared for. Since March, I have been almost constantly within hearing of skirmishing, cannon, and etc., and I would give almost anything to get away for a time so as to have a little rest. In another letter to his niece, Ewell wrote about the horrors of the war and its cause. Some 100,000 human beings have been massacred in every conceivable form of horror, with 3 times as many wounded, all because of a set of fanatical abolitionists and unprincipled politicians, backed by women in petticoats and pants and children. Ewell wouldn't get to rest, however. A corps under Pope traveled toward the Confederates at Gordonsville, losing contact with the rest of the army. Jackson planned to attack the isolated unit before it could be supported. What became the Battle of Cedar Mountain saw Ewell's division divided, with Early's brigade taking the brunt of the fighting from the division. Ewell took the rest of the division to the right, placing artillery at Cedar Mountain. Early's men fought doggedly alongside Jackson's division and were relieved when A.P. Hill's division came up and halted the Yankee attacks. Soon Lee came to Gordonsville with the rest of the army. With his 2 halves of the army together, Lee formulated a plan to send Jackson's force, including Ewell, behind the Union army and cut off its supplies and communications along the railroad. The hot sun in late August beat down on the rebel soldiers as they marched through the Virginia countryside, bent on ridding Virginia of John Pope. Ewell joined Stonewall Jackson in his expedition to get behind the Union Army of Virginia, led by John Pope, and destroy the enemy's supply and communication lines. At Bristow Station, Ewell's men disabled multiple locomotives and captured numerous railroad cars. Manassas Junction contained more supplies, and Jackson took 2 divisions to capture that location, while leaving Ewell to guard against any Union threat coming from the west. When a section of Pope's army approached Ewell's men guarding the roads to Manassas Junction, the Union threat began to push Ewell, and the Confederate general sent a courier to Jackson, asking what he should do if he found the enemy superior in number and offering stiff resistance. Jackson soon sent word back that Ewell was to not bring on a full engagement, but slow down the movement of the enemy. In a beautifully done rearguard action, Ewell extricated all 3 of his brigades, performing what looked to be a leapfrog-style maneuver, with one brigade falling back a quarter mile, then the next brigade would fall back behind them. All the while Ewell moved his infantry. The artillery played havoc amongst the Union infantry, at one point driving them back in such haste that the artillery could leisurely limber up and fall back. Ewell's talent and abilities were on full display as he halted the Union Army's advance and delayed them until nightfall. Once Ewell and Jackson reunited, Jackson decided to get closer to Robert E. Lee and the other half of the Army of Northern Virginia to avoid being cut off. Twice during the march, Brigadier General Isaac Trimble got lost, and Ewell had to find him and put him back on the right path, coming to part of the First Manassas battlefield from the year previous. When Ewell found Jackson, he and General Tolliver were drinking buttermilk out of a canteen. Ewell begged to be given some of the cold liquid, but it was all gone. but if Ewell would send an orderly to accompany the horseman who brought it, then they would bring him back some. Ewell eagerly agreed, and said buttermilk was a delicacy not to be despised on such an evening by the commander-in-chief himself. It was August 28th, and it seemed as though no fight would occur, but in the evening, Rufus King's Union division began marching on the road parallel to the Confederate position near an unfinished railroad cut. Jackson assessed the situation and then ordered Ewell and Tolliver to send in their troops. Tolliver made contact first, with Ewell's men getting hung up at the cut, forcing Ewell to throw his troops in brigade at a time as they arrived on the field. Ewell was riding a borrowed horse, but he found it impossible to control and turned the animal over to an aide. When some of Trimble's men were hit by rifle fire from the 6th Wisconsin, Ewell personally led a regiment of Georgians to flush out the men from Wisconsin. The Federal troops directed their fire toward Ewell, who was on his left knee to see below some pines. A bullet pierced the joint from the top, shattering the patella and the head of the tibia before lodging in the muscles of the calf. Some soldiers tried to carry him off the field, but he snarled, "Put me down and give them hell. I'm no better than any other wounded soldier to stay on the field." Campbell Brown, his cousin, aide, and future stepson, arrived to find him laying amongst some other wounded soldiers. Ewell refused to be moved, believing he was too badly wounded to be moved and that the surgeons should operate on him right there. Jubal Early, one of Ewell's brigade commanders, convinced Ewell against it and that he could be moved. Surgeons also agreed that he could be moved and thought he might be able to keep his leg. Members of the 58th Virginia carried the general to a house just below Sudley Ford, which had been made into a field hospital. During the Second Battle of Manassas, hospital attendants moved Ewell to a home 4 miles to the rear out of the range of the bullets. There, at the Harris Buckner House, on August 29th at 2 p.m., surgeons amputated Ewell's left leg above the knee. Dr. Hunter McGuire performed the surgery. The limb was wrapped in an oilcloth and buried in the corner of the Buckner family garden. The surgery took a toll on the general, who teetered between life and death, his pulse dropping and growing weak. Brown stayed by his bedside, giving him brandy and water every 15 minutes. He grew strong enough to withstand a trip to his cousin's house, where he would be cared for as the Army of Northern Virginia entered Maryland. Ewell laid on his camp bed in the parlor of the home, being fanned by the Pueblo boy Friday, and his black valet, John Frame, served him meals. Ewell suffered greatly from his wound. At one point, part of the bone pierced his stump, and more bone needed to be sawed away. The threat of nearby Union cavalry resulted in Ewell's staff moving the general to Richmond. By December 1862, he could get around on crutches, but on Christmas Day, he fell and broke off a piece of the bone at the end of his stump. The accident set him back another couple of months. While in Richmond, Ewell lobbied for some of his subordinates to get a promotion. He recommended Jubal Early and Robert Rhodes to gain rank, which they secured. Isaac Trimble asked for Ewell to lobby the president for promotion to Major General, but Ewell took no action. Ewell rarely recommended subordinates for promotion, but one he took particular interest in was James A. Walker, colonel of the 13th Virginia Regiment. He wanted him promoted to brigadier general. Walker would eventually achieve this rank and command the Stonewall Brigade. It was during his convalescence that Ewell became more religious and given up his hard drinking and use of profanity. Some believe his religious conversion began much earlier when he was in the Shenandoah Valley, when he allegedly walked in on or overheard Stonewall Jackson praying and said, "If this is religion, I must have it." Either way, Ewell's religiosity grew exponentially in the months after his wounding. Ewell used crutches to get around until he became comfortable with his wooden leg and a cane, which he became proficient in using. By May, Ewell was ready to come back to the Army of Northern Virginia, but he had something to do before rejoining the ranks. He and Lazinka married in Richmond, Virginia, with President Jefferson Davis and the First Lady Varina in attendance. Lazinka remained by Ewell's side during his recuperation, traveling from Alabama to Richmond for her fiancé, nursing him back to health. Because he was a Confederate official, Ewell knew his property could be confiscated by the U.S. government and didn't want Lazinka's land and other property taken, so he signed a prenuptial agreement taking no ownership of her land. There was no honeymoon for the couple. Just days after getting married, Ewell traveled to Fredericksburg to take command of the Second Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. Stonewall Jackson, Ewell's commander, died from pneumonia after being shot by his own men at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and Ewell was promoted to lieutenant general and took command of Jackson's old corps. Robert E. Lee, the commander of the army, divided his army into 3 corps as opposed to his previous 2. James Longstreet commanded the 1st Corps, Ewell the 2nd, and A.P. Hill the 3rd Corps. Each corps had 3 divisions. Ewell's divisions were commanded by Jubal Early, Robert Rhodes, and Edward Allegheny Johnson. Ewell formally took command of the corps on June 1, 1863. It was also on that day that Lee brought his corps commanders together and explained his plan to invade Pennsylvania. Lee spoke to Ewell about Ewell's state of mind. Lee and Ewell himself knew that the new corps commander lacked decision-making abilities. One moment, Ewell could be optimistic about a movement and be pessimistic the next. A few days later, Ewell began moving his troops from their position around Fredericksburg and moved west, then north through the Shenandoah Valley. Ewell's corps would be at the lead of the whole army. On his way to Culpeper, Ewell rode through the Chancellorsville battlefield with his topographical engineer, Jedediah Hotchkiss, explaining what happened there just 1 month before. When his new corps saw him, they cheered. Sandy Pendleton, one of his staffers, commented, "He resembles General Jackson very much in some points of his character, particularly his utter disregard of his own personal comforts and his inflexibility of purpose. He is so thoroughly honest, too, and has only one desire, to conquer the Yankees. I look for great things from him, and am glad to say that our troops have for him a good deal of the same feelings they had toward General Jackson, which must increase very much when they find on trial that he is so good a man." Before entering the Shenandoah Valley to begin the push north, Ewell attended the Grand Cavalry Review put on by Jeb Stuart and assisted that general with infantry support when the Battle of Brandy Station erupted soon afterward. Then the Second Corps moved into the valley. One object stood in Ewell's way, an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 man garrison at Winchester, Virginia, commanded by Union Major General Robert Milroy. Attacking Milroy would take a skilled commander, because if the garrison escaped, they could contest the Confederate movement across the Potomac River. Ewell sped his troops down the valley and engaged with Milroy's troops at Winchester and at Stevenson's Depot. It was a wonderful success. Ewell took 4,000 prisoners and captured 400 rounds of artillery ammunition, 6,000 bushels of grain, 300 horses, and over 20 cannons. Officers and men alike began to compare Ewell to Jackson, especially since it was just 1 year earlier that Jackson routed Nathaniel Banks from the same field, albeit with Ewell's help. One officer wrote, "Ewell won his right to Jackson's mantle at Jackson's game on Jackson's ground." Ewell's men began to move into Maryland and eventually Pennsylvania. He visited them and kept active during this stage of the campaign. During one of his rides to visit his troops, a group of women presented him with gifts: a hat, 2 pair of buckskin gauntlets, a box of underwear, and a pair of boots. The ladies heard that Jackson's head was small and his feet large, and when Ewell attempted to try them on, one of his staff officers commented that the hat couldn't be worn by anyone in the corps, it was so small, and the boots couldn't have fit anyone of ordinary shape. Ewell thanked the ladies, kept the underwear and gloves, which were of normal size, and distributed the rest to friends and members of his staff. As the corps pushed into Pennsylvania, cherries hung in bunches from the trees of farmers. Privates, all the way up to Ewell himself, indulged in the fruit. Ewell couldn't climb the trees because of his leg, so a teenager in the ranks picked them for Ewell, who ate so many the man marveled that such a small man could hold so many cherries. Ewell and his corps pushed on to Chambersburg, with part heading toward York and the other heading toward Carlisle. At Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Ewell occupied the same building he had once lived in as a lieutenant in the Dragoons. A delegation of ministers called on Ewell and asked if they were permitted to have church the next day. Ewell said, of course, that he would like to attend church himself. The ministers left, but then returned with another request. They asked if he minded them saying a prayer for Abraham Lincoln at their services. Ewell responded, "Not at all. I know of no man who is more in need of your prayers." Ewell and his generals raised the Confederate national flag over Carlisle, and they made a few speeches, one of which was made by Isaac Trimble. After being wounded at the Second Battle of Manassas, Trimble took a few months to recover and try to get a promotion. He did, and was assigned to the Valley District. But when the army moved into Maryland and Pennsylvania, he joined it, first hanging around with Lee, then went on to Ewell. He pestered Lee and Ewell. At Carlisle, he commented that he could take the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, with 1 brigade and 4 cannons. Meanwhile, Ewell formulated a more reasonable plan to capture the city. Ewell was about to put his plan into action when Lee sent him a message to unite with the rest of the army at a crossroad town called Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee ordered Richard Ewell to proceed with his corps from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to the little town of Gettysburg. Ewell began moving his corps south to meet up with the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia. As he neared the town, reports came in about enemy forces occupying the area, and he sent out scouts to assess the situation. On July 1st, A.P. Hill's corps engaged with Federal cavalry and then the Union's 1st Corps. The 11th Corps would be right behind. Ewell only had the divisions of Jubal Early and Robert Rhodes with him. The other division, under Edward Johnson, was further to the west. Rhodes occupied Oak Hill and acted as Hill's left flank in the attacks on Oak Ridge and Seminary Ridge. The 11th Corps threatened Rhodes' left flank, but Early's division arrived just in time. Ewell was with Rhodes during this stage of the fighting on Oak Hill, watching the engagement play out. As Rhodes and Hill pushed the Federals through the town, Ewell rode to meet with Early. During his ride, an artillery shell exploded near him, sending a piece of shrapnel into the head of his horse, toppling the animal and throwing the rider. If Ewell was dazed by the event, he didn't show it. Moving to the north end of the town, he rode amongst John B. Gordon's men. Gordon urged Ewell to press on to take Cemetery Hill, just beyond the town. As they were talking, Henry Kidd Douglas, from Johnson's staff, rode up to Ewell and said that Johnson was just a few miles away. Gordon, excited by the news, declared that when Johnson came, he could join that division in an attack on Cemetery Hill. Ewell explained, "General Lee is still at Cashtown, 6 miles in rear. He directed me to come to Gettysburg, and I have done so. I do not feel like going further or making an attack without orders from him." Ewell rode into the town square in search of Early and Rhodes to consult with them. Walter Taylor of Robert E. Lee's staff relayed the message from Lee to Ewell to take Cemetery Hill if he could do so to advantage. Ewell remained in the square, and to many it seemed as if he was sitting idle. In fact, he was waiting on his division commanders to return so they could consult about an attack. Harry Hayes, one of Early's brigade commanders, urged Ewell to press on to attack Cemetery Hill, but Ewell just laughed and asked if his men ever got tired of fighting. Hayes responded that he was only concerned about needless slaughter of his men in future attacks on the location. Ewell's staff was filled with men from Stonewall Jackson's old staff. As they watched Ewell wait for Early and Rhodes, one remarked, "Jackson is not here." When Early arrived, he and Ewell proceeded through the town and personally reconnoitered Cemetery Hill. Federal troops occupied it. At least a brigade behind a stone wall was formidable, and it bristled with around 40 artillery pieces. Ewell waited on word from Lee. He had sent a messenger to ask Lee what to do next. The courier came back saying to take the hill if possible, but the courier still said to avoid a general engagement. Ewell was frustrated and baffled by the message. Isaac Trimble came to Ewell and told him he should capture Culp's Hill because it would make Cemetery Hill untenable. Trimble kept arguing the point until Ewell snapped and said, "When I need advice from a junior officer, I generally ask it." Trimble then left. Ewell now began getting reports of Union threats to the northeast. He dispatched 2 brigades to investigate. Next, he sent 2 men to Culp's Hill to see if it was void of enemy troops. They came back with the information that it remained empty. Johnson arrived ahead of his division to get his orders, and he and Early and Ewell began discussing moving troops to the hill. Ewell selected Early's division since it would still be a while before Johnson's men arrived. Early argued his men were wore out because they had done the hardest marching and fighting of the day, and that resulted in a small war of words between Johnson and Early. In the end, Ewell let Early have his way and ordered his division to go into camp. When Johnson's division arrived, Ewell asked Rhodes and Early what they thought of sending Johnson to Culp's Hill. Rhodes said it wouldn't make any difference, but Early said if he didn't, It would cost 10,000 lives in the morning. Ewell took Early's advice and told Johnson to move his troops to that location. By this point, Union troops were already forming on the hill. Ewell, Rhodes, and Early met with Lee at his headquarters. Early answered many of the questions for Ewell. Lee suggested that since Ewell's corps couldn't do much on the Confederate left, that they be brought around to the right to bolster attacks over ground that was more favorable. Early explained that Johnson would be taking Culp's Hill, and it would be foolish to give up such a commanding position that they could use. Lee agreed, and the meeting ended. Later that night at 10 p.m., Ewell received a message from Lee that the Second Corps was to leave the left and move to the Confederate right. Ewell returned to Lee's headquarters and argued against it, still insisting that Johnson would take Culp's Hill. Lee relented. Ewell returned to his headquarters only to find that Culp's Hill had been occupied by enemy troops, and worse, a captured Union courier possessed dispatches detailing that the 12th and 5th Corps would be on the field by tomorrow morning. Ewell had convinced Lee to let him remain on the left, but he probably would have done better service on the right. Lee's orders to him now were to make a demonstration against the Union right as Longstreet assailed his left. Ewell expected an early morning attack on July 2nd from Longstreet, but none came. He asked Lee, and Lee explained that Longstreet's corps hadn't come up yet. The attack would be delayed. Longstreet's attack got underway by 4 p.m. Ewell had some men climb into the cupola of a church to watch Longstreet's attack and give him updates on how it was going. The soldiers reported to Ewell that Longstreet's attacks were a splendid success. With that, Ewell opened up an artillery barrage on Culp's Hill that got silenced because the Confederate artillery was on an inferior hill. It was past 7 before Johnson's division made their attack. Then Early made his attack on Cemetery Hill. Early was supposed to get support from Rhodes, but it never materialized. Early was furious. When the attacks failed, Early and Ewell went to Rhodes' headquarters to find out why he didn't attack. Rhodes insisted that he couldn't make the attack because Hill's closest division couldn't give him support, but Ewell surmised it was because Rhodes failed to deploy his men properly. Ewell received orders for him to support Longstreet's attack the next day. Ewell prepared for a dawn assault, but the Federals beat him to the punch, launching their own attack. Ewell needed to draw the enemy's attention so that Longstreet would have a better chance at breaking the center. His men battled for hours, and Longstreet's attack kept getting postponed. Eventually, Ewell pulled his men back, unable to do anything further. Afterward, Ewell rode to inspect his position. He got close to Cemetery Hill, but was warned that sharpshooters were present, and they liked to pick off officers. Ewell thought the distance too great and went forward. One of his staff members was shot, and when asked, Ewell said he had been hit too. A staff officer jumped off his horse and asked where he had been hit. He showed the staffer his wooden leg. Ewell jokingly said, "I'll trouble you to hand me my other leg." The staffer got the extra wooden leg and attached it. Ewell remarked to Gordon, "Suppose that ball had struck you. We would have had the trouble of carrying you off the field, sir. You see how much better fixed for a fight I am than you are. It don't hurt a bit to be shot in a wooden leg." Pickett's charge failed on July 3rd, and both armies stayed idle for the rest of the day and into July 4th. Lee's army began their retreat back into Virginia on Independence Day. Ewell would be the rear guard, with Hill leading the army back into the Old Dominion, and Longstreet between Hill and Ewell. One of Ewell's biographers succinctly yet thoroughly explained Ewell's role in the Battle of Gettysburg. He wrote, "Lee's orders played an important role in Ewell's decision not to attack Cemetery Hill. While on Oak Hill, Ewell received instructions from Lee not to risk a general engagement until the rest of the army arrived. After Ewell had entered the town, he received permission from Lee to attack the hill if he could do so to advantage, but in the same breath Lee reiterated his earlier order to avoid entanglement with the enemy. Faced with these seemingly contradictory orders, and finding that he could expect no help from A.P. Hill, Ewell waived an attack on Cemetery Hill and determined to seize Culp's Hill instead. The capture of Culp's Hill by Johnson's division would effectively turn the Federal position and render an attack on Cemetery Hill unnecessary. It was a sensible solution to a thorny problem. Unfortunately, it did not work. Ewell acted as the rear guard for pretty much the entire retreat back into Virginia, finally reaching Orange Courthouse on August 1st. He was eager to get there because his new wife, Lizinka, was making her way from Charlottesville to see him. She raised Ewell's spirits, but many of Ewell's staff believed she took Ewell away from his duties. Ewell heard the talk and harshly disagreed with them. When a Catholic priest came by headquarters, Ewell decided to ask him about the picnics and parties Ewell and Lizinka attended, hoping to find an ally. The priest said, "How do you think our soldiers must feel, confined in their camp and living on such rations as they now get, whilst they see their officers riding about the country, gallanting ladies, indulging in luxuries, and at the same time neglecting their business? I tell you, General, these parties had better be stopped, or they will do much injury to your men. It is not the time for them." Ewell did not stop the parties or the picnics. He continued to entertain his wife. Huge grand reviews occurred between August and October, with Lee attending each to help lift the spirits of the soldiers. The ranks heard about the defeats at Vicksburg and Knoxville, and the retreat of the Army of Tennessee during the Tullahoma campaign. In September, Lee dispatched Longstreet's corps to Georgia to help Braxton Bragg and the Army of Tennessee. With the Army of the Potomac back in front of Lee's army, the rebel army commander decided on a bold plan to turn the flank of the Union Army and trap it against a river, or force it to go back to Washington's outskirts. A few days into October, the Bristow Station campaign began, with Ewell's corps and A.P. Hill's corps swinging in an arc to the west, flanking the Federal Army, which began to retreat. Lee's troops pushed all the way to Bristow Station, but during the Union withdrawal, Jeb Stuart's cavalry got trapped between two Union corps. Stuart hid his men in some trees and got a message through enemy lines to Lee, informing him of the predicament. Ewell was the man to help extricate Stuart from the trap. It was Hill's corps that fought the Battle of Bristow Station, with only a handful of Ewell's troops attempting to take part, but played no significant role. This area was Ewell's homeland. His childhood home, Stony Lonesome, lay not far away. Union soldiers had vandalized the home, taken most of the sheep, and helped themselves to books from the Ewell Library, and even took some letters written to the family from Thomas Jefferson. Ewell tried to help salvage what he could, even digging up the family's china, which his relatives buried before they left the home. Lee pulled his army back behind the Rappahannock River, bent on holding it against the Union Army when it moved again. The Army of the Potomac wasted no time pushing all the way up to the river, and on November 7th, the Federal troops began breaking through Lee's defenses at Rappahannock Station. The ensuing battle resulted in a Confederate defeat, and Lee again moved his army back across another river, this time the Rapidan. Ewell was heavily criticized, although he wasn't in that sector when the battle erupted. He was at Kelly's Ford. Lee was closer to the battle, and Jubal Early was in direct command of the forces opposing the Federals. Nevertheless, Gettysburg's stigma continued to follow Ewell, with many lamenting not having Stonewall Jackson in command of the corps. No soldier was more expressive of their disdain for Ewell than Sandy Pendleton, a member of Ewell's staff. He wrote home constantly about how Ewell wasn't fit to lead a corps, and Pendleton also threw barbs at Lizinka, calling her unattractive. Pendleton probably resented Lizinka for ruling headquarters like she ruled her husband, and on that front, he had a point. After the Battle of Rappahannock Station, Ewell got an abscess on his stump from an ill-contrived wooden leg. Ewell insisted that he could remain at the front, but Lee insisted he take leave and that Jubal Early take command of the corps in his absence. Ewell got a doctor to prescribe him just a few days' rest, as opposed to 10 days, as the original order stated. Near the end of his leave, the Mine Run campaign began, when the Union Army advanced across the Rapidan River. Ewell rushed to the front and expected to be placed in command of his corps, but Lee told him to go to the rear, that he wouldn't restore him during an active campaign. The restoration took some time, and Ewell felt dejected. A depression rolled over him, as he knew he had lost Lee's confidence. Lee in his own way was attempting to remove Ewell from commanding the corps, but Lee wouldn't outright remove him. During this limbo status, Ewell asked one of Early's staffers if he ever wished himself dead, adding that he sometimes thought it would save him a great deal of trouble. Clearly, Ewell was distraught, but on December 4th, Ewell was restored to command. During the winter, with the removal of Braxton Bragg as commander of the Army of Tennessee, and a reorganization needed, Ewell's name got batted around in the Confederate War Department to either take command of the Army of Tennessee or to replace Longstreet in East Tennessee with Ewell. His name also came up when discussion arose around commanding troops in West Virginia, but every time Lee or someone else shot down the suggestion. Outwardly, Lee always expressed concern in Ewell's health and its prevention of him doing his duty. However, historians suppose that Lee lacked confidence in Ewell to exert independent command. In the end, Ewell remained with the Army of Northern Virginia in command of its Second Corps. All along the Rapidan River, Ewell examined his position thoroughly in early 1864. He hoped to not be caught off guard like at Rappahannock Station. Unfortunately, in February, Union General Alexander Hayes, an old West Point friend of Ewell, led his division across the river and surprised Ewell's troops, with only an artillery battery to contest the crossing. Ewell heard the cannon fire and rushed to the sector. Seeing the dilemma, he calmly told his cannoneers to hold them off for 10 minutes, and he would have infantry in the trenches waiting to throw back the Yankees. True to his word, within minutes, Ewell brought up John Pegram's brigade, and behind them, John B. Gordon's brigade to the scene of the action. Hayes continued to battle with Ewell's troops until darkness covered the field. Ewell examined his lines in the darkness. While performing this duty, he stumbled upon 2 mounted Union officers. He captured one, but the other got away. The captured officer told Ewell that the man who got away was Hayes himself. Ewell responded that if he had known it was Hayes, he would have knocked him down with his wooden leg. The Union forces retreated in the night, and the Confederate line was safe. However, Ewell's staff encountered another lingering threat, Lizinka. The wife of Ewell was getting on the staff's nerves. It's common to see in the records that when she visited, many of his staff members found other places to be. One of them wrote, "The very cleverness, which would at other times render her agreeable, has only tended to make her more unpopular. She manages everything from the general's affairs down to the courier's, who carries his dispatches. All say they are under a petticoat government." Despite many people seeing Lizinka as ruling headquarters, Ewell still held power, and one moment shows the true character of the general. Lizinka got word that Ewell planned to recommend Sandy Pendleton, his chief of staff, for a promotion. Lizinka told her husband that Pendleton didn't deserve it, that her son Campbell Brown, or her soon-to-be son-in-law Tom Turner, should get the promotion. Plus, she added, Pendleton had criticized the general behind his back. Ewell quickly responded, "The connection I cannot see. If he is likely to make a good brigadier general and to whip the Yankees, I would recommend him if he were my worst enemy. I directed on Saturday Campbell and Turner to reconnoiter the country in a certain direction. They would be ready Monday. Monday they would be ready Tuesday, because they had found on Monday they had no money, and I didn't send them. Pendleton was sent as far, on more troublesome duty, was ready at once and returned promptly, doing his duty well. Which is the best friend?" To help raise morale within the army through the hard winter months, the governor of North Carolina, Zebulon Vance, visited the Tar Heel troops. He made numerous speeches, and one soldier explained, "A number of other generals have been to hear him every time he spoke. General Lee has heard him twice, and I understand that old General Ewell has nearly shaken his wooden leg to pieces, laughing at his jokes." May 1864 brought Lizinka's reign of terror at the headquarters to an end because the spring campaign began. Lee stood with his 3 corps commanders, Ewell, James Longstreet, and A.P. Hill, on top of Clark's Mountain, viewing the Union camps across the river. The army commander prophesied that the enemy would soon cross the river on his right flank, and for his corps commanders to be ready. On May 3rd, the Union Army of the Potomac was spied moving, and the campaign began. The new lieutenant general of all the Union armies, Ulysses S. Grant, made his headquarters with the army opposing Lee, and was bent on striking the enemy. Ewell moved out on May 4th, heading east along the Orange Turnpike that led to Fredericksburg. The corps and its commander camped along the road that night. Lieutenant Robert Stiles of Cable's battalion of Virginia Artillery found Ewell that night by himself. except for a lone courier who held his crutches and assisted him on his horse. Ewell liked Stiles and even called him my child at various times. They sat and drank coffee, and as they talked, Stiles asked if Ewell objected to revealing his orders. Ewell took no offense at the request and said, "No, sir, none at all. Just the orders I like, to go right down the turnpike and strike the enemy wherever I find him." On May 5th, Ewell's corps encountered Federal troops on the Orange Turnpike and began deploying the divisions of Edward Johnson and Robert Rhodes on either side of the pike. A miscommunication on the right led some brigades falling back prematurely, and the line was threatening to collapse. Early's division was coming up, and that division commander ordered his forwardmost brigade under John B. Gordon to quickly deploy. As Gordon rode off to bring up his men, Ewell yelled out, "General Gordon, the fate of the day depends on you, sir." And Gordon replied, "These men will save it, sir." Ewell watched Gordon deploy his men and remarked, "Isn't that magnificent? It ought to make Gordon a major general." The Battle of the Wilderness raged along Ewell and A.P. Hill's front on May 5th. By May 6th, Ewell repositioned his front and threw back Union attacks. Throughout the day, Gordon approached Ewell multiple times, insisting that the Union's right flank wasn't anchored on anything, and it was in the air with no reserve behind. Ewell couldn't spare any more troops to help support Gordon in the attack he proposed to make. A threat on the Confederate center between Hill's line on the Orange Plank Road and Ewell's on the turnpike occupied a lot of time and troops. Eventually, Ewell allowed Gordon to make the attack, striking the Union perpendicular and driving them south, but he could only spare one other brigade to assist them, and it would be performed near dusk so that the Federals wouldn't know how weak the attacking force was. The attack was a success, but it fell apart in the darkness, not accomplishing what Gordon hoped. Grant and the Union Army commander George Meade disengaged, but not to move back across the river. They intended to move toward Richmond by way of Spotsylvania Courthouse. The Battle of the Wilderness ended, but the campaign was in full swing. According to one of Ewell's biographers, Ewell's performance in the Wilderness had been good and at times superb. By the skillful use of his reserves, he had protected his flanks, repulsed every attack directed against him, and made a successful assault of his own, all without supervision from Lee. He suffered just 1,125 casualties, while inflicting fully 5 times that number on his enemies, including in the latter figure were more than 1,000 Union prisoners. Ewell, along with Richard Anderson, the temporary commander of Longstreet's corps, following that general's wounding in the Wilderness, and Hill, cut Grant off and set up defensive positions. Ewell's troops commanded among many places a location called the Muleshoe, by the way it jutted out from the rest of the Confederate line. Lee and Ewell examined the location, and Lee didn't like its position, but it sat on a ridge, and if Ewell didn't fortify it, then Federal troops could place artillery there, and the rebel line would be untenable. On May 10th, Emory Upton, a rising star in the Union Army, planned to take 12 regiments and bust through the northwest section of the Muleshoe. That area was commanded by George P. Doles, and Ewell was with Doles when the attack commenced. Ewell nearly got captured when Upton swarmed over the works. Ewell stayed at the front, encouraging his troops still there to hold on and that he would have reinforcements in just a few minutes. True to his word, Ewell brought up more troops to help seal the breach. The whole time Ewell wasn't alone. From one account, we believe Friday, the Pueblo boy that Ewell brought from the southwest with him, was actively riding along the lines, shooting at the enemy. One observer wrote, "I may live to be 100 years of age, but I will never forget that little boy, his pony rearing up and pawing in the direction of the enemy, and the gallant little soldier firing his tiny pocket pistol as earnestly as Murat heading a charge." The situation was handled, and the Muleshoe defenses were restored. But on May 12th, another attack, even larger, broke through the Muleshoe, sending the Confederates reeling. Ewell and Gordon worked feverishly to stem the tide of blue troops swarming into their sector. One soldier even commented that Gordon was foaming at the mouth. A brigade of Alabamians were on their way to the front when their commander ordered them to lie down and wait until orders to go in. Ewell saw the men laying down and scolded them for laying down, but it wasn't soldierly to do so in the face of the enemy. One soldier jumped up, not wanting to look cowardly, and at the same time, Ewell realized the error he had made and said, "If you were ordered to lie down, that's all right." As Ewell assured the young man that it was perfectly fine to be on the ground, the rest of the rank and file smiled as the two men conversed. A humorous description of Ewell during the fight comes from a Virginian who saw Ewell working at his mobile officer's desk about 400 yards behind the main line, with artillery shells pelting the area. The shells were falling fast and furious all around. Ewell was wearing an artificial leg in the place of the natural one he lost near Sudley's mill. He had become very nervous, and every time a shell exploded near him, he would hop his good leg up and curse with the vehemence of an old trooper and the unction of a new church member. As cowards began to run for the rear, Lee and Ewell, in their diverse ways, tried getting them to return. Lee calmly reminded them of their duty, and Ewell cursed them. Ewell lost his head at one point and began to beat the soldiers across the back with his sword. Lee reprimanded him, saying, "General Ewell, you must restrain yourself. How can you expect to control these men when you have lost control of yourself? If you cannot repress your excitement, you had better retire." The Confederates were able to form a new line and fend off the Union attacks, and when the Army of the Potomac moved, Ewell attacked part of it at Harris Farm. It was there that Ewell lost his third and final horse, a sorrel mare. Ewell took a hard fall, and some soldiers had to roll the animal off their commander. Grant continued to press southward, and Lee blocked him at every turn he could. Around the Battle of the North Anna, Ewell became sick, and Lee removed him from command of the corps until he felt better, replacing him with Jubal Early. When Ewell recovered after a few days, he approached Lee to get his command back. One of Ewell's biographers put it succinctly when he wrote, "Lee had determined as early as the 29th of May that Ewell should not return to the army. Initially, he denied him command on the basis of his health. When Ewell produced evidence that he had fully recovered, Lee abruptly changed tactics and insisted that it would be too hazardous to change commanders in the middle of an active campaign. But Ewell called his bluff by remaining with the army. As the armies entrenched, Lee reverted to his previous argument that Ewell was too feeble to undergo the rigors of a grueling campaign. Ewell knew better. He stubbornly argued that his health was better than it had been for some time. Lee thereupon changed tactics again, arguing that Early deserved a chance at higher command. This inferred that Ewell had not measured up to his responsibilities as corps commander. When Ewell challenged that statement by pointing to the corps' record since the opening of the campaign, Lee abruptly ended the dialogue and insisted that Ewell go to the rear. It was a sad denouement for the gallant old soldier. Why was Ewell removed? The answer, of course, is that Lee had lost confidence in him. Richard Ewell took command of the Richmond defenses after being removed from his corps, but he didn't remain there long before he nearly got taken to another theater of the war. He didn't know about the discussions happening in the War Department, but it was June 1864, and Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk had just been killed north of Atlanta, Georgia, and his corps needed a new commander. The commander of that army, Joseph E. Johnston, requested Ewell to be sent to Georgia to take command, but in the end, it went to Alexander P. Stewart. Ewell didn't discover that he was in the running for such a command until Stewart was already chosen. When he found out, he remarked, "Had I have thought Johnston wanted my services, I would have gone in spite of everything. I would be a captain under him if he were a colonel of a regiment. He was my only hope of regaining command." Ewell took command of the Richmond defenses as Ulysses S. Grant, George Meade, and the Army of the Potomac were encircling Petersburg and attacking Richmond. The Federals threw a bridge across the James River at Deep Bottom and made a threat against Richmond. Ewell requested the Secretary of War, James Seddon, to call out the local defense troops, the troops under Ewell's command, but Seddon wouldn't release the troops until Ewell insisted he needed them. The local defense troops were mechanics and clerks inside of Richmond, and that could be called up for defending the capital, but otherwise needed to remain at their jobs to make sure the Confederate government and the war machine kept running. Seddon wouldn't release them easily. On paper, Ewell had 6,000 troops, but in reality, he had none until they were called upon. By the time the Secretary released the troops, the threat to Richmond was over. One of Ewell's biographers explained it like this: "For Ewell, it was a no-win situation. If he called for the local troops at the first sign of danger, he risked incurring the wrath of Seddon and other government officials. On the other hand, If he delayed summoning them until the city was in actual peril, as the Secretary insisted, they would arrive too late to do any good. It was a problem that afforded no easy solution. Threats came and went through June, July, and August, but in late September, Ewell faced one of his biggest threats to Richmond to date. Benjamin Butler's Army of the James was making a thrust toward the capital, and Ewell had but a handful of troops to defend the works north of the James River. He called on the local defense troops, but it would be hours before they arrived. Union forces busted through Fort Harrison, and Ewell feared they could enter the capital by sunset. To buy time, Ewell grabbed every man he could and did a show of force in a wooded area that stymied the Federal advance. It eventually forced the Union to break off the engagement, bowing to unknowingly an inferior force. One soldier remembered, General Ewell was with the skirmish line, constantly encouraging them by his presence and coolness. I remember very distinctly how he looked, mounted on an old gray horse, as mad as he could be, shouting to the men, and seeming to be everywhere at once. More attacks came against Ewell's lines, especially by David Birney's 10th Corps, which contained a large portion of black troops. Upon attacking Fort Gilmer, black troops became stuck in the ditch in front of the fortification. Many of the black troops surrendered when they couldn't extricate themselves, but upon exiting the ditch were killed by Confederates. The actions of his soldiers got back to Ewell, who sent back orders stating, "Colonel, tell your men they must be patient and prudent. These blacks are now Federal soldiers, and we must treat them as such." The order stopped the killing. Ewell had saved Richmond from capture, but his efforts had gone pretty much unnoticed. Many historians today have taken notice of Ewell's contributions. One wrote, "Such qualities had shown before in those halcyon days ere the 2nd Corps had ever heard of Cemetery Hill. At 1st and 2nd Winchester, at Stevenson's Depot, at Cedar Mountain, at Strasburg, and above all, Cross Keys. Yet great as were his accomplishments then, they do not equal his achievement this day. Acting in the face of imminent danger to forge and sustain a continuous line from Fort Gilmer to the James that bade fair to contain the Federal breakthrough and save Richmond was the greatest contribution Ewell ever rendered to the Confederate cause. Although he couldn't retake Fort Harrison with the few troops he possessed, he brought his troops closer to Richmond and threw up a new defensive line. He and Lee rode out to examine the area, and Ewell's horse took a tumble, rolling over its rider. Lieutenant Colonel Moxley Sorrell saw the accident and thought Ewell broke his neck, but he was just badly bruised and bleeding. By that evening, Ewell was back at work, wrapped up in bandages like a mummy, as one soldier described it. As winter set in, Ewell took his headquarters to Richmond and enjoyed going about town with Lizinka and the family. One day, while poorly dressed, he ran into Colonel Duff Green, who had lost a leg and used a wooden replacement. As they talked, an older citizen walked up to both men, saw their disability, and offered them both jobs in his factory in Georgia. They told the man who they were, and the factory owner replied, "Well, gentlemen, I beg your pardon, but you looked like common folks mightily." Ewell's appearance even fooled his men. While driving an ambulance, a member of a heavy artillery unit asked the general for a ride. Ewell agreed, and while transporting the man, the artilleryman asked, "To what command do you belong?" The driver replied, "I belong all around here generally." "You present a very striking resemblance to General Ewell," the soldier remarked. Ewell asked, "How do you know it is not him?" "I would not expect to see him riding in an ambulance." "Does General Ewell never ride in an ambulance?" "Probably he does, but I would think it strange to see him alone and driving himself." The soldier finally discovered it was the general who was driving him, and they continued to have a good discussion. In early 1865, with manpower draining from the Confederate Army around Richmond and Petersburg, the Confederacy finally allowed for slaves to be armed and join the Confederate Army. Robert E. Lee assigned Ewell the task of organizing these soldiers, since Ewell had advocated for arming African Americans as early as 1861. 2 companies were formed, but they would see no action. Seeing the end was near, Ewell sent his wife and family north. Lizinka traveled to Washington, D.C., then eventually to St. Louis to stay with friends. On April 1st, the Confederate right flank that extended far to the west to guard the supply routes into Petersburg and Richmond was crushed at the Battle of Five Forks. An early morning attack on April 2nd saw Lee's line break in half, and the Confederate Army commander called for the evacuation of Richmond. Ewell received his orders and prepared for his troops to leave the city. The sight of the president and other Confederate officials, along with the government documents leaving the city, told the story to the citizens of the capital. Panic spread through the streets as looters and vandals tried to steal what they could in the chaos. Ewell foresaw these actions and petitioned the city council to assemble a volunteer police force to maintain order in the event of an evacuation. The city didn't pursue that action, and only one man volunteered to help. The city paid for the council's inaction. Ewell possessed around 7,000 troops with local defense troops and Kershaw's division of Longstreet's corps. He tried to maintain order with what troops he could spare, but it was no use. Ewell and the Secretary of War, John C. Breckinridge, sat outside the War Department as the warehouses containing cotton and tobacco were set ablaze. One soldier remembered the scene. Breckinridge, as he sat on his fine horse, was simply magnificent, his noble face bright and cheerful, giving no sign of the anguish that wrung his heart. He spoke strongly and calmly, giving his orders and his advice to General Ewell and others around him. Ewell looked the wreck that he was. His thin, narrow face looked wizened and worn and twitched nervously, as did his arms and hands. I had seen him at his best. Here was his worst. The old hero looked worn and shaken at this heartbreaking crisis. Ewell thought it was a waste of time and effort to burn the tobacco warehouses. Breckinridge had ordered it. Ewell would remark, "I acted under orders, but regret that those orders did not include Breckinridge, who should have been thrown into the hottest of the flames." Ewell resisted any accusations that he burned the city. He held to the idea that Unionists inside Richmond set fire to the other buildings and denied his firing of the warehouses contributed to the destruction of the city. Years later, the warehouse owners tried to sue for damages, but the judge threw it out, but not before it caused Ewell some stress. Ewell evacuated the city with the troops he possessed, aiming for Amelia Courthouse, where he was to meet up with the rest of the army. He had to leave behind Friday, the Pueblo boy who came with him from the southwest and who had been beside Ewell throughout the war. He was sick and in the Jackson hospital. When Richmond was captured, Friday followed a doctor to North Carolina and was never heard from again. From Amelia Courthouse, the Confederate columns proceeded west. Men straggled and deserted all along the route. A group of hungry soldiers killed an ox that wandered too close and began to consume it raw. It was a desperate time, made even more desperate, when Ewell and Richard Anderson's troops got trapped at a location called Sailor's Creek. Ewell formed up his battle line in preparation to throw back an assault by Union forces, who had finally caught up to the retreating rebels. As Ewell waited for the attack, a soldier overheard Ewell saying to another officer, "Tomatoes are very good. I wish I had some." The casual statement gave the eavesdropper a sense of calm amid the rain of artillery shells. Both Ewell and Anderson's battle lines broke, resulted in their encirclement. Ewell's men threw down their weapons, and Ewell's force ceased to exist. Ewell surrendered with his men. He was taken to General Horatio Wright's headquarters, the commander who directly opposed his forces at the Battle of Sailor's Creek. The two knew one another from West Point. As Ewell dismounted, Wright said, "I am glad to see you, Ewell." Ewell responded, "I'll be blanked if I'm glad to see you, Wright." It was all bluster, and before long the two men were enjoying each other's company. Soon Philip Sheridan joined them, a man who caused great harm to the Confederacy through his campaign in the Shenandoah Valley and outside of Petersburg. All three men and other officers had dinner, then congregated outside of Sheridan's tent. They talked about their West Point days and the current campaign, but Ewell stayed out of the conversation for the most part. One observer wrote, "Fighting Dick Ewell looked like an old eagle with one of his wings clipped." When he did enter the conversation, he said that the war was over when Grant crossed the James River and the Confederacy should have sought peace negotiations, but their insistence on independence made the cause lost, and they had no right to claim anything. For every man that was killed after this, somebody would be responsible, and it would be little better than murder. He could not tell what General Lee would do, but he hoped that he would at once surrender his army. On April 7th, Ewell left his horse with Wright, then took an ambulance with 5,000 Confederate prisoners, as well as 7 generals, to Burkeville Junction, Ulysses S. Grant's headquarters. When they arrived, Grant wasn't there, but Ewell scribbled a note letting him know that he had burned the warehouses in Richmond under orders to hopefully subvert any attempt to bring charges against him, and this would make his innocence a matter of record. Ewell was on his way to Ford's Station when word came that Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Ewell and Custis Lee were together when the news arrived. Lee just hung his head, and Ewell threw up his hands and said, "The jig is up." Near Ford's Station, Ewell was welcomed to Orlando B. Wilcox's headquarters. Wilcox found Ewell despondent and blaming Jefferson Davis and the rest of the Confederacy's political leaders for the defeat. Wilcox wrote to his wife, "I think U.S. Grant had something to do with the matter." From City Point they were transported by water to Washington, D.C. Confederate General Hunton remarked that Ewell carried between $500 and $600 in gold and used it to improve his own accommodations, but didn't help Hutton, who was suffering from diarrhea and a fistula. When the ship anchored at D.C., former Postmaster General Montgomery Blair was waiting for Ewell. Blair and his wife had been friends of Ewell's family and of Lysinka, and they wanted Blair to give Ewell some money to help him through his captivity. Because of the threats on his life, Ewell was taken by a carriage to Pennsylvania Avenue, where Blair gave him the money, and his older sister, Rebecca Ewell, came to see her brother. From there, Ewell and other officers were whisked to Fort Warren in Boston Harbor. The next day, aboard the Jersey ferry, Ewell received the news that Abraham Lincoln had been shot. Union General Benjamin Butler was aboard the train and told him. Ewell threw up his hands and cried, "My God, I am sorry for that. It is the worst thing that could happen to the South." Passengers called for the rebel generals to be thrown overboard, but Butler put an end to the blustering passengers. From New York City, they were taken by railroad to Boston. When it was announced that Lincoln was dead, Ewell reportedly wept. Bystanders along the railroads yelled 3 groans for Ewell and pelted the car with rocks. The 2-week journey ended with the Confederate generals reaching Fort Warren safely, but it had been a perilous journey. Neither Ewell or anyone else knew how long they would remain at the fort, especially with the death of the president. It could be months or even years. Fort Warren was a dark and damp location for Confederate officers. Ewell wasn't alone. He was there with a number of generals. Ewell hoped that the same terms given to Lee and the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia would be granted to him, but that didn't materialize. Even Lee asked for that, and specifically mentioned Ewell and his invalid status as a reason to release him. But not even Lee could help Ewell at that. Ewell knew who to blame. He wrote to his wife Lysinka, "I thought we were entitled to the terms of Lee's men, but I suppose must thank Booth for that, and numberless future woes." Ewell hoped to help soothe the tensions in the wake of Abraham Lincoln's assassination by getting the Confederate generals held at Fort Warren together and issuing a statement declaring that they did not condone or assist in the assassination. One of the generals, Hunton, vehemently criticized such an action. He wrote, "I asked them if they thought it becoming of 13 gentlemen who were thought worthy to wear the stars of general officers of the Confederate Army to declare to the world that they were not assassins. By great exertions and the efforts of several who came to my aid, the resolution was defeated. I asked General Ewell where the leg he lost at Second Manassas was buried, that I wished to pay honor to that leg, for I had none to pay to the rest of his body. He replied that he didn't know where it was." Hunton wrote this in the post-war era, but his opposition to it didn't stop Ewell from sending it, and in the list of officers who supported the letter, Hunton's name was on it. So we may never know truly if Hunton tried to revise his earlier stance, or Ewell placed his name on the letter without Hunton's permission. The prisoners were permitted to take walks throughout the day, and Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, could see the generals performing their exercise and noticed Ewell hobbling on crutches. He asked a guard why he didn't have a wooden leg. The guard said that Ewell explained that artificial legs were expensive, and if he were going to be hanged, he wouldn't go to the trouble to buy one. Monotony tormented the inmates. They tried to break the boredom by growing plants, reading books, playing chess and cards, and reading the newspaper. Ewell found that he was misquoted in some newspapers when a flood of doctors came to Fort Warren, being in Boston for a medical convention. They visited the inmates, asking them questions. They asked Ewell about the coming of the war. Ewell responded, "I told them I was absent in Arizona in '60, and had come in sick in the spring of '61, that I was quite unwell in a secluded part of Virginia, and found the war suddenly inaugurated, that on one side I had a handsome position, good pay, and some means saved from long years of service. All this I forfeited by going south, but that I had to fight with or against my state, and did what the people of Massachusetts would have done, and which I should have done at forfeit of my head. They agreed somewhat with my views, and I saw myself published in the Boston papers as hurrying in from Arizona to take part in the war, and many other like absurdities, the greatest being that I did not regret being taken prisoner. Mabel Appleton was the 3-year-old daughter of the post commander. She came to visit her father and then made her way where the Confederate generals were taking their walk. She was a big hit with the group, and they doted over her, eventually sending her a box of candy. She sent a letter back thanking them, and her parents included a lock of her hair. Ewell hoped that President Andrew Johnson's amnesty proclamation would set him free, but he did not meet the qualifications. He had been trained at West Point, been a general officer, and with Lysinka's land and money, he now possessed over $20,000 in property. He had become disillusioned by the war. He knew the Confederacy had failed and willingly accepted it. He wrote to his wife that he was heartily anxious to become a law-abiding member of the community if allowed, and would be the best one to be found, either to put down guerrillas or stop the mouths of demagogue talkers of sedition, the worst of the two provided the government establishes such an office. I am willing to take either amnesty or allegiance, as I have seen nothing yet that one with these views should object to. Lysinka was dealing with her own problems. Squatters filled her property lots in Nashville. President Johnson's family occupied her home in Nashville, and much of her property in Tennessee and other states was destroyed. Lysinka and her daughter Hattie had escaped to St. Louis from Richmond at the beginning of 1865 and turned themselves in to the local authorities there. They remained on house arrest, but were allowed to take the oath of allegiance and travel to Tennessee to inspect her land. She tried to get her land restored, but ended up getting arrested by order of President Johnson himself and taken back to St. Louis. Eventually, Lysinka went to Washington to plead her case to the president. In a 3-hour meeting, she secured the restoration of her property and the release of her son Campbell Brown, but couldn't get her husband released from Fort Warren. She visited them in prison and saw the horrible state of her loved ones. She dashed off a quick letter to Johnson complaining of the brutal treatment and wanting their immediate release. What she didn't know was that even before she wrote the letter, Johnson had a change of heart and informed her that he would release both men, but Ewell would have to post a $10,000 bond, which he happily did. The Ewells remained in Virginia for a short duration, Ewell himself thinking he could farm his family home of Stony Lonesome, but the war had ravaged it, and it never produced much anyway. After Ewell secured from Washington permission to move to Tennessee, Johnson helped Lysinka regain all of her property. The Ewells began running Lysinka's Spring Hill Farm in Maury County. The Maury farm was predominantly a stock farm, but it did grow corn and cotton to varying degrees of success. Lysinka ran a large dairy on the place, but soon got out of the dairy business because it was becoming too expensive. Ewell's specialties revolved around breeding mules and sheep. He sold mules to former Confederate Generals James Longstreet and Carter Stevenson, but his prized animals were his sheep. They became his main priority. Also at the farm were chickens and goats. One of the latter became an enemy of the general. As Ewell walked down the farm lane, one of his male goats came walking toward him along the same path. Neither man nor beast wanted to give ground to the other, and when they approached, Ewell tried to move the animal aside. The goat stuck his horns between the general's legs and toppled Ewell. The goat backed up to butt the general, but Ewell popped him in the nose with his wooden leg until a farmhand could come to the rescue. In May 1866, Ewell and Lysinka took a summer-long vacation, first traveling to St. Louis to visit Lysinka's daughter, then New Orleans where Ewell met with General Richard Taylor. A stop in Louisville saw Ewell reminisce with Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith and Union General Don Carlos Buell. A whirlwind tour of 2 Virginia's mineral springs rounded out the vacation. At one of the springs, Ewell visited with Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. The Ewells returned to Spring Hill in August 1866. In the later half of the 1860s, Ewell directed his attention and efforts to property in Mississippi, staying away from Lysinka for months at a time. Her last husband had done the same thing to her, and she feared Ewell was the same. She wrote him some angry letters, saying she wouldn't stay at Spring Hill much longer without her husband, and that she would not be coming to him in Mississippi. Ewell raced to Spring Hill to calm her down, and then turned right around to oversee his Mississippi property, then headed to New Orleans to take in some vapor baths to help with his neuralgia. While in the Crescent City, he attended worship services at Trinity Church and shared a pew with Confederate Generals Cadmus Wilcox and James Longstreet. You'll recall that it seemed all eyes were on him when he sat next to Longstreet, who had become a pariah in New Orleans for switching to the Republican Party. Ewell wrote to Lysinka The fact is, most people seem to want to quarrel with someone, and I don't know with whom. All in talking of Longstreet regret that people took the course they did in tabooing him, and I believe if it were to go over again, they would not follow the same plan as regards him. Ewell had gotten cotton fever and for 3 years leased a plantation in Mississippi and turned a profit, but he decided not to renew the lease and returned to Spring Hill by 1871. He wasn't heavily involved in veterans organizations like some generals, but he was a member of the Memphis chapter of the Confederate Historical and Relief Association, as well as served as the vice president of the Lee Memorial Association, an organization dedicated to erecting a statue to Robert E. Lee following the Army commander's death. Even though Lee removed Ewell from Corps Command, Ewell didn't hold a grudge. In 1868, he donated $500 to Washington College, where Lee was president, under the condition that the donation would be used to augment Lee's salary. Lee wrote to Ewell that, "I fully appreciate the kind motives which prompted you thus to appropriate it. But when I tell you that I already receive a much larger amount from the college than my services are worth, you will see the propriety of my not consenting that it should be increased. The great want of the college is more extensive buildings, suitable libraries, cabinets, philosophical and chemical apparatus, etc., etc. A liberal endowment will enable it to enlarge the means of its usefulness, to afford facilities of education to worthy young men who might not otherwise obtain one. And as we must look to the rising generation for the restoration of the country, it can do more good in this way than in any other." When Lee passed, Ewell remarked to his stepson and former staffer Campbell Brown, "The greatest man in America lies dying in Lexington today." Ewell's family was growing rapidly. Campbell Brown and Hattie were both married and had multiple children, and although they weren't Ewell's biological grandchildren, he treated them like they were. He took the boys out on horseback rides and the girls on carriage rides. When one of the children playfully swatted Ewell on the nose with a stick, her mother was about to spank her until Ewell protested, saying that he didn't want the child spanked on account of himself. It wasn't just his grandchildren who occupied his time either. A farmhand and his wife that worked for Ewell abandoned their children, and the Ewells took care of them. As 1871 ended, Ewell's life was very successful from all his ventures, and he had amassed a sizable fortune. But by January 8, 1872, after a cold ride from the farm, Ewell came down with a fever. Nearly the entire household was taken with a fever at that time, but when doctors came in, they found Ewell suffering from not just a fever, but pneumonia. He seemed to rally, then have setbacks for days, but was growing weaker. He asked to amend his will. It hadn't been changed since June 1863, soon after he married Lizinka. At that time, he wanted all of his property to go to Lizinka and her heirs, but now he had amassed a lot more wealth and decided to give some to his family. In it, he also dictated that Campbell Brown's son, Ewell, get his shotgun and that $500 go toward erecting a monument on his mother's grave in Williamsburg, Virginia. This last wish never got carried out. Lizinka remained close by her husband's side throughout this ordeal, but she too came down with pneumonia. She struggled and passed away on January 22nd. The family didn't tell Ewell, who was still ill, but when it looked as though he wouldn't last much longer, they told him. He asked for a picture of her to be hung around his neck, and he placed it over his heart. They brought her body into Ewell's room for him to see her one last time. After gazing over her face, he said, "It is all right." He asked for them to delay burying her so they may be interred together, but that wish went unfulfilled. With her dying first, Ewell now received by order of her will half of her estate, but he had just amended his own will to give his family his fortune. Now half of Lizinka's estate would go to his family, and he did not believe that was right. He emphatically told his family that all of Lizinka's estate should go to Hattie and Campbell, her children, and they agreed to the decision. Just before catching pneumonia, Ewell was wearing a thin pair of surplus U.S. Army pantaloons. Believing that it aided him getting sick, he said on his deathbed, "After all my fighting against the United States so long, it is strange that an old pair of infantry pantaloons should kill me at last." Ewell's cousin and close confidant Tasker Gant had recently sent Ewell some agnostic literature to turn him away from God. In his last days he remarked to his son-in-law and former aide Tom Turner, "Captain, those books of Gant's are all stuff. I don't know how it all is, but the mercy of God is greater than the mercy of men. Ewell dictated his own funeral arrangements, saying he wanted a simple ceremony where his friends and comrades could come and pay their respects in a plain way. He said he didn't want a monument over his grave, just a headstone saying he had been a lieutenant general in the Confederate Army. Above all, he insisted that nothing disrespectful to the United States government be inscribed upon his tomb. On January 24, 1872, following the funeral for Lizinka, Ewell's minister came to the home and administered one last communion service. Afterward, Ewell asked Hattie if he would make it through the night. Hattie didn't see the point in giving him any false hope and said, "No, General." Ewell replied, "I would rather die, but am willing to live if it is God's will." His breathing got more difficult as the night went on. Around 1 a.m. on January 25th, he began to mumble incoherently, not about a distant battlefield, but about his brother Ben. He then closed his eyes and went to sleep. He ceased breathing at 1:30 a.m. He was 54 years old. The funeral was held on January 26 at Christ Church, preceded by a procession of 22 carriages. Among the attendees were former generals John C. Brown, Lucius Polk, Bushrod Johnson, Edmund Kirby Smith, William B. Bate, and William H. Jackson. Afterward, the body was carried to Nashville City Cemetery and buried beside his wife. His tombstone reads, "Richard Stoddard Ewell, third son of Dr. Thomas and Elizabeth Stoddard Ewell, was born at Georgetown, D.C., February 8, 1817, and died at Spring Hill, Tennessee, January 25, 1872. On the reverse side of the tomb, it states Ewell was a lieutenant general in the Confederate Army, as he wanted. Other than that, the word peace, encircled in a wreath of laurel, adorns the stone. Historians, history buffs, and popular history have lambasted Ewell, especially for the Battle of Gettysburg. Even Ewell's contemporaries needed someone to blame for the battle, and they latched on to two men, Ewell and James Longstreet. Ewell gets criticism for not taking the high ground south of the town, but the admonishments of Ewell go back further than just the battle. They stem from the fact that Ewell stepped into Stonewall Jackson's shoes as the commander of the Second Corps. But Ewell wasn't Jackson, and it's irresponsible to try and make him fit into that mold. Ewell was his own man, a general who was well respected in the old army and in the Confederate Army. He and Jackson secured the Shenandoah Valley in the spring of 1862, and Jackson heavily relied on Ewell while they were together. To draw a conclusion on Ewell from one perceived mistake is negligent. Of course he had faults. Even Lee saw them in his inability to make decisions on his own. Ewell constantly referred to his most trusted subordinate, Jubal Early. Beyond his military skill that he exhibited, especially during the early parts of the war, one can appreciate and admire Ewell's inability to hold a grudge. When he was removed from Corps Command and believed he was done wrong, he never held it against Lee, who he fully supported. He even asked to be demoted to command a division just so he could remain with the Army of Northern Virginia. Most people only remember him for his mistakes, but let us not forget his beautiful rear guard action in the Northern Virginia campaign, just prior to the Second Battle of Manassas, his quick and decisive movements in the Shenandoah Valley, his quick handling of the garrison at Winchester on the invasion of Pennsylvania, the steadiness he exhibited on the Orange Turnpike during the Battle of the Wilderness, and his determined resolve during the Appomattox campaign. In the post-war world, he didn't try to set the record straight about his campaigns, and didn't get heavily involved in veterans organizations. It seemed as though he just wanted to put the horrible conflict behind him and do what he loved most, farm. For that, he became an easy target by not fighting back, and that shaped the way people today view him. In reality, he was a well-trained soldier with tremendous experience and a good heart, a noble resolve, and humility.